It's gone. Right. Good afternoon, everybody in the room and out there. Just before we resume with the opening, just one matter arising from this morning. There were a couple of rebuttals that we weren't 100% sure that we've got. One from XR Elders and one from BAAN, and I can confirm we have got them all. We just did a double check. Okay, on that basis, Mr. Humphreys, back to you.
Thank you, sir.
I'm sorry, Mr. Humphreys. I keep interrupting you. You are quite softly spoken, but the suggestion from the people who are helping out with the tech is that you've got a second microphone.
I wondered about that, but I wasn't sure whether it would cause feedback.
One way of finding out.
No? Oh, well, then I'm very, very happy.
Right, over to you again then.
So I got to page 42 and air quality, and again, that's a topic that I'm going to try to take quite quickly, not because it's not important, but because I think we've set things out fairly clearly there. We set out the legal and policy context, air quality standards, air quality objectives, and summarize certain of the relevant policies. And then, bottom of page 43, we introduce the assessment of effects. Probably the thing just to draw your attention to at the top of page 45 is that the revised assessment in the ESA, using updated information, demonstrated that the air quality impacts of the proposed development, although not negligible, are small and not significant in EIA terms. The assessment found that the concentrations of NO2 in both of the core case scenarios to be appreciably lower than those reported in the ES, as a result of a smaller contribution from road traffic sources due to reductions in emission factors over time. And this is one of those topics where, because of greater numbers of electric vehicles and vehicles that have better performance in terms of NO2, background levels get better over time. And no need for me to read the rest of that, but again, for PMs, PM10, particulate matter, and PM2.5, the assessment was negligible. Bottom of page 44, there were two sort of principal challenges, para 177. One was uncertainty because of future fleet mixes, and the other's ultrafine particles. And we deal with those in the two following paragraphs. As far as uncertainty is concerned, it's important, sir, to recognize that aircraft are a relatively small contribution to NO2 at ground level because the aircraft are high and the NO2 is hot and it quickly just disperses into background. It's road traffic low down near receptors that is more relevant as a whole, as a generality. Also, aircraft are not major sources of particulate matter emissions, and so again, uncertainty on those things just doesn't make a significant difference. As far as ultrafine particles is concerned, as NSE acknowledged, there's no means of quantitatively assessing these. They are, if you like, a subset of PM 2.5, but importantly, when we had our scoping opinion from the council, they were effectively scoped out. They weren't one of the things we were asked to assess. So, para 185, a summary of our case, the approach adopted in the ES and the ESA is in accordance with guidance. It addresses the pollutants that were agreed with NSC at the EIA scoping stage, in addition to providing an indication of likely impacts from ultrafine particle concentrations insofar as it is possible to do so. The assessment is robust, and the uncertainty regarding aircraft fleet forecasts or the precise year does not have a material impact on the conclusions of the assessment. The results indicate air quality impacts of the proposed development are small and are not significant in EIA terms. Even using the more pessimistic assumptions in the ES, the officer's report found the impacts to be acceptable. And one of the things we have to do under conditions, as we say there, is prepare an air quality action plan. Health, again, an important topic, but again, one I'll take relatively swiftly. Again, assessed by officers, we did produce a health impact assessment. And overall, the health impact assessment identifies a positive impact on health of the development, that being largely driven by socioeconomic benefits. So the important thing perhaps to touch on here, and we begin to deal with this in paragraph 194, 95, you can read it and you can read Mr. Piper's evidence, but the impacts that we need to focus on are population health impacts, not individual health impacts. Individual health impacts obviously are characters of the many individual factors that relate to people's health, but it's population health that is important here. And Mr. Piper's evidence does explain that in some detail by reference to a large volume of guidance on these things. And so the summary of our case at paragraph 204, 205 is that the inputs to the assessment of the proposed development on health, namely noise, air quality, and socioeconomic benefits, are robust. The approach adopted in the ES and the ESA for determining the significance of health effects is in line with national and international guidance on good practice. Standing back, there is simply no evidential basis on which to argue that the proposed development will have significant adverse effects on health at a population level. This is a conclusion with which the NSC officers, Public Health England, and NSC's Public Health team all agreed with. Indeed, the assessment indicates that the proposed development would have a beneficial impact on population health through the provision of real socioeconomic benefits, such as good quality employment. So we then come to climate change, and I'll perhaps read a bit more of this, in part for the reasons I indicated at the outset. It's an issue that, perfectly understandably, attracts a lot of public attention, but where really it needs to be understood in the context of this inquiry, it needs to be understood properly in the context of the legal and policy parameters that exist. So climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions generated by the proposed development and the associated impact on climate change forms the basis for reason for refusal 3. That reason for refusal makes 3 allegations, namely that the scale of the greenhouse gas emissions, 1, would not reduce carbon emissions, 2, would not contribute to the transition to a low-carbon future, and 3, would exacerbate climate change. The legal and policy provisions cited are the MPPF, Policy CS1, the core strategy, and the duty in the Climate Change Act to achieve net zero, the net zero target by 2050. The impact of the proposed development on greenhouse gas emissions and ability to meet climate change obligations was your issue F. So legal and policy context, the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change within the framework of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was adopted at COP21 in Paris 2015 and entered into force in 2016. The Paris Agreement sets out the long-term temperature goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In order to achieve the long-term temperature goal, parties, that's the contracting parties, nations, aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible and to undertake rapid reductions thereafter in accordance with best available science, so as to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. So this is, in effect, net zero. So it's this balance of anthropogenic sources and anthropogenic sinks, and not by 2050. Actually, Paris Agreement is by the second half of the century. The mechanism by which these ambitions are to be delivered is through each country publishing and accounting for what are called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. And the UK submitted its one in December 2020. Previously, it had been submitted with us as part of the EU. In fact, because I think it had the revolving presidency by Latvia, but we've now submitted our own. The Climate Change Act 2008, the UK's contribution towards meeting long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement is enshrined in domestic law by the 2008 Act. When the Act came into force, it placed a duty on the Secretary of State to ensure that the net UK carbon account, so that's what the target relates, the net UK carbon account for 2050 is at least 80% lower than the 1990 baseline, but the target was subsequently amended in June 2019 to be at least 100% below. So this is, when we talk about net zero, this is what we mean. And just as an aside, the word net is important. It's not absolute zero, it's net zero. It's the whole point about sources and sinks. This whole concept of also reducing things or offsetting and those sorts of things are implicit. In addition to the 2050 target, so the UK set up at the time, and it still is, world-beating target that we would do this by 2050. The obligation in Paris was the second half of the century. In addition to the 2050 target, the CCA, the Act, poses an obligation on the Secretary of State to set 5-yearly carbon budgets in order to achieve the 2050 target. Each 5-yearly budget is to be set 12 years in advance as a series of interim targets. Section 4 places an obligation on the Secretary of State to ensure that the budget is met. So you have the target in 2050, these 5-yearly budgets which reduce in order to meet that target. Section 32 of the Act established the Committee on Climate Change to advise government on matters relating to climate change, including the target, the carbon budgets, and international aviation. 6 carbon budgets have been adopted to date. The 5th, which runs for the period from 2028 to 2032, was set in 2016. The role of the CCC, so it's important to appreciate the role of the CCC and the limitations on that role. The CCC exists to advise government. Its advice must be taken into account by the government in making policy and setting climate change strategy, including the budgets. The role of the CCC is not, however, to make government policy, nor is there any obligation on the government to adopt every recommendation made by the CCC. Its advice is but one consideration in a much wider range of factors that must be taken into account when determining the direction of government policy. That this is the case can be seen from the government's departure from certain recommendations contained in the CCC's 6th Carbon Budget report. And again, I give the reference there. In that report, the CCC recommended that international aviation would be brought into the net zero carbon budget rather than being within a planning assumption, which I'll explain later. The CCC considered 5 scenarios for managing aviation emissions: a balanced pathway, headwinds, widespread engagement, widespread innovation, and tailwinds. And as part of the balanced pathway option, the CCC recommended that aviation measures are required to reduce sector emissions to 23 megatons CO2 equivalent per year by 2050 for international, domestic, and military aviation. On the 20th of April 2021, the government announced the sixth carbon budget will include international aviation and shipping in line with the CCC's recommendation. It announced that a carbon budget was based on a reduction of 78% of emissions compared with the baseline of 1990 by 2035. However, the press release also stated that government would look to meet this reduction target through investing and capitalizing on new green technologies and innovation, whilst maintaining people's freedom of choice, including their diet, because there were implications about whether people should not eat meat, because that's obviously agriculture is a major source of greenhouse gases. And in a sense, what you've got in the Decarbonising Transport document that came out yesterday is the sort of further detail on this point that they were going to meet the target through investing in capitalising on new green technologies and innovation. It made clear that the carbon budget target was based on the government's own analysis and did not follow each of the CCC's specific policy recommendations. This was recognised in the recent inspector's report into the Stansted appeal. It's also clear from the government's Jet Zero consultation, which says, in terms, our analysis shows that there are scenarios that can achieve similar or greater CO2 reductions than those in the CCC's balanced pathway, which limits growth to 25% by 2050 compared with 2018 levels, compared to a baseline of 65% growth. By focusing on new jobs and technology with knock-on economic and social benefits rather than by capping demand. So it's very clear in the latest documentation, and you know, it is, you know, the statements last week are extremely important to put in context government's strategy on this. Place of aviation in the context of carbon targets and budgets. Section 10 of the Act requires that in setting budgets, Secretary of State take into account the estimated amount of reportable emissions from international aviation and international shipping for budgetary periods or periods in question. The estimated amount of reportable emissions means the aggregate of the amounts relating to emissions of targeted greenhouse gases from international aviation, is also marine, but international aviation, that the Secretary of State will be required to report for that period in accordance with the international carbon reporting practice. So this is, in a sense, the legislative framework by which we get this concept of the planning assumption, or it's sometimes called the aviation target, because the Act requires international aviation to have been taken into account in setting budgets. Government needed to know what it had to take into account, what had to be set, and that was set. The 37.5 was set as a recommendation by the CCC. I can't remember. I think it was back in 2008 or 2007. So Section 30 of the Act provides that emissions of greenhouse gases from international aviation or international shipping do not count as emissions from sources in the United Kingdom for the purpose of this part, except as provided by regulations by the Secretary of State. In other words, they weren't part of the net UK carbon account, which I mentioned earlier. Legally, they weren't part of it, but they had to be taken into account when setting the budgets. Emissions from international aviation and shipping were not therefore formally included within the first to fifth budgets. Instead, these emissions were taken into account in accordance with the Act by setting budgets at a level that allowed headroom for these emissions. In other words, the budgets were set lower by the amount of the headroom. So if the budget needed to be this much, international aviation's that much, they actually set the budget at the lower level. They allowed for it with the headroom. The figure allowed for aviation emissions in the first to fifth budgets was 37.5 megatons CO2 per annum. This figure is also known as the planning assumption. It's, I think, also sometimes called the aviation target. On 21st of June 2021, the government announced a sixth carbon budget. This budget covers the period 2033 to 37 and is set to align with the UK's latest nationally declared contribution under the Paris Agreement. At the same time, the government announced a new target for reducing emissions by 78% compared to 1990 levels by 2035. For the first time, the carbon budget will formally include emissions from international aviation and shipping within the budget figure, rather than being accounted for as a planning assumption. Whilst this changes the formal means of reflecting the emissions from international aviation in a carbon budget, it doesn't change the fact that such emissions have always been accounted for in the budgets. Just means instead of now setting the budget that much lower, you just set the budget where it needs to be. You don't need to account. There is no planning assumption anymore because it doesn't need to be. It's in the budget. Since 2005, paragraph above, the 6th Carbon Budget Order 2021 provides that the carbon budget for 2033 to 2037 budgetary period is 965 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. When you look at CD 938, which is the statutory instrument, the order, I've quoted nearly all of it. There's no breakdown. It doesn't say, oh, and aviation has this bit, and energy has this bit, and other things. No, it just says, this is the budget. It's not further broken down, and there is no longer any headroom to be taken into account, as there is no planning assumption anymore. It just sets a budget for all the things covered, including aviation. Since 2005, the UK has participated in the EU emission trading scheme, which has included the aviation sector since 2012. As part of the UK's withdrawal from the European Union, the UK ETS has replaced the UK's participation in the EU ETS with effect from the beginning of this year. The UK ETS was established through the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Order 2021. So that set up, that document, CD 936, set up the UK ETS. Aviation within the European Economic Area, so slightly wider than the EU, has been brought within the UK ETS, and it is anticipated that airlines will be given allocations of carbon allowances that will be consistent with UK carbon budgets. Beyond such allocations, airlines will have to purchase additional allowances under the cap and trade system. Just to make the point about the EEA, for Bristol, which is obviously a shorter haul airline, I think it's about 88–90% of all its flights are within EEA. So nearly, not quite all of them, but 88–90% are within the EEA, and therefore will be covered by the UK ETS. Under the UK ETS, a cap on allowances each year will initially be set at 5% below the UK's expected notional share of the EU cap. The government has stated its intention to consult on an appropriate trajectory for UK ETS cap following the 6th Carbon Budget Report, with the aim of aligning the cap to the net zero trajectory. So the allowances under the ETS will be set, again, consistent with our achieving net zero. But there are some movements Bristol which are not within the EEA, and this is where CORSIA comes in. So the government has consulted on the interaction between the UK ETS and the UN's CORSIA, a global measure adopted by the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a part of the United Nations, to supplement industry initiatives to reduce carbon emissions. CORSIA will apply to those emissions not covered by the UK ETS, i.e. flights beyond the EEA, and enables airline operators to purchase carbon credits from the carbon market to offset emissions. CORSIA has 3 phases: the pilot and first phase, which runs to 2023, and then 2026 respectively, and the second, which runs from, so those are 2 phases, and then the next one, which runs to 2035. The pilot and first phases, in which the UK intends to participate, are voluntary, but the UK has said it will participate. The second phase would include the majority of countries based on proportion of aircraft movements. The government's recently established Jet Zero consultation document emphasizes the importance of international agreements to meeting the challenges of climate change. In its consultation, the government has reiterated its intention to fully participate in the scheme. So I then go on, sir, to explain how that works. And from paragraph 232, I sort of set out, our assessments in the ES and the ESA, and emphasize point 233 that our witness, Mr. Osland, explains that the emissions we have calculated are a reasonable worst case when compared to the 5 scenarios in the CCC's sixth carbon budget reference given. And also the methodology we adopted was agreed with officers. So 237, paragraph 237, we've carried out 2 assessments of significance because the things for us to compare with have slightly changed. So the first one is we compared ourselves with the planning assumption, the 37.5 megatons, to see if, compared with that, we made a significant difference. But we then compared ourselves in Mr. Osland-Island's evidence against the framework to see whether the legislative framework, policy framework, to see whether we would prevent the government meeting its climate change obligations by 2050. And in short, our point on that is no, government has clearly set out its comprehensive framework. Airlines will have to live within that. They will be capped and they will have to trade if they need to use more allowances than they are given, and they will have to, in accordance with decarbonising transport, innovate away from more carbon-producing flights. 240, I'll just touch on this as well. It's also important to note that the quantum of emissions in our ESA does not itself reflect the trajectory to decarbonise aviation as set out in the Decarbonising Transport Plan. Obviously it didn't, because that's very recent. In other words, we calculated emissions. What's very clear from the Decarbonising Transport Plan, however, is that government is going to incentivise and invest in innovation, and therefore, in other words, the move to jet zero for the UK's domestic and international aviation will also be reflected in emissions of flights to and from Bristol Airport. I mean, they'll just be part of what happens in the UK generally as flights are decarbonised. Flights from Bristol would be decarbonised, meaning that our forecast emissions will reduce over time compared with the figures in the ESA. Thus, the emissions of the ESA are again very much a worst case in the long term, because the whole of UK aviation will innovate away from current levels of emissions. We say that the UK ETS in the next paragraph is a robust mechanism for government to ensure emissions are capped, and it was challenged. The UK ETS was challenged in the High Court in a case called Elliott Smith earlier this year. 243, the High Court rejected the ground of challenge and recognised that the Paris Agreement was an unincorporated international treaty and that it was not the role of the court to definitively agree with this. So the point about unincorporated, so international treaties, if they're, the UK is a dualist system, so the law exists at an international level and then at a national level, domestic level. International treaties can't be accessed by individuals in the country. They don't have the equivalent of EU law of direct effect. They're international. They only have effect to which they are incorporated into national legislation. That's why it's called an international, it's an unincorporated treaty. The way in which it's incorporated in the UK is obviously through the Climate Change Act and other things. So that's the point that I'm trying to make it here. In any event, the High Court recognised that this was unincorporated and it was not the role of the court to resolve definitively questions of construction of an international treaty, and that the government's interpretation was appropriate. 245, I return to something I touched on right at the beginning, non-aviation emissions of buildings and ground operations, and we've explained our strategy in relation to that. And 247, we then set out various of the challenges, and again, in each of these headings under challenges, we haven't been exhaustive, but we try to identify for you the main themes, and from 248, why we reject those. And at 249 onwards, again, I won't read it out, but we summarize our case, but in a nutshell, our point is that aviation, i.e. meaning aircraft, those emissions will be effectively controlled by our national system of control, and it's a matter of government policy, and government's made it very clear that it has the levers to control that, and if it doesn't, it will take more of them. I mean, it is sovereign in Parliament. But that as far as the airport's emissions go, its buildings, its vehicles, its ground operations, we have a very detailed strategy for dealing with those, and indeed one, as I said, the Decarbonising Transport Plan actually points us out as a leader in that particular regard. So page 63, transport. Again, here the opening submissions sort of characterize the area, and that historically the access to the airport has been very heavily car reliant. Page 64, we identify national policy, 65 regional, and then local policy. And I won't go through that in detail. 66, we deal with the transport assessment and the addendum to that. And again, would like to sort of emphasize, without reading through it all, that this was pulled together very much in consultation with the council and the council's consultants. The improvement to the A38 was very much designed in a collaborative way, which we found very helpful. And 267, you can see the officers' report and their conclusions, which at a technical level we absolutely support. So I then set out 268, the addendum, and so the issue at 269, and it's not easy to grasp, but there is this issue about what the public transport mode share is, and historically at Bristol Airport, the public transport mode share was calculated because the public transport is by bus, by numbers of bus tickets. You'll see this in Mr. Witchell's evidence. In fact, there are reasons why we know that that underestimates public transport. For example, people buying a through ticket, from a rail and then going on to bus, or people arriving by coaches where there weren't bus tickets and things of that sort. But at all airports, including Bristol, the CAA carry out very extensive surveys, and they give public transport mode shares. In fact, on that basis, Bristol's public transport mode share is much higher. It's over 21% currently. And indeed, far from being, as many people say, one of the lowest for regional airports, it's actually one of the highest for regional airports, as Mr. Witchell's evidence shows by producing some of the CAA data. But what we are proposing is a stretch to that by an additional 2.5% on the actual, which we say is an appropriate and challenging public transport mode share. 272, I set out there are summarized points in relation to the A38 improvements, which have led to the compulsory purchase order. I don't need to summarize that, but 276 deals with parking demand. And here again, the assessment is actually very conservative, because for parking demand, we it's based in the parking demand study. It's based on the actual number of people parking, and then we assume the extra 2.5% by public transport. Whereas for highways, looking at the impact on local roads, we assume the bus ticket mode share. In other words, we overestimate the number of people on the road. So that parking looks favorably, to reduce the number of parking spaces needed, whereas highways looks at it the other way and will overestimate the number of people on the road. Mr. Witchell's evidence explains all of that, and he can explain it when we get to that particular topic. But if I get to paragraph 289, the summary of our case on this, with regards to our case, the following point should be noted at this stage. The methodologies used in the TA and the TAA were the result of a long process of negotiation and discussion with NSC, Highways England, and the surrounding highway authorities. NSC officers and Highway England were satisfied that the approach adopted and the results produced by that analysis, and any criticism now levelled at the approach should be viewed in this context. The results of these assessments indicate that even on a worst-case scenario, I've just mentioned, the impact of the proposed development on the highways network would, with mitigation, not be significant. The proposed junction improvements will provide a significant reduction in queuing and delays at the A38 West Lane downside road junction compared to what is currently consented, which do not propose any further improvements. The parking demand study, which forms the basis of the car parking proposals, was considered by NSC officers to be robust. It has been validated against the TA and the TAA, which represents a reasonable worst-case scenario for highways. The need for a total of 22,200 spaces, assuming a 2.5% increase in public transport use, is the minimum required to meet the demand associated with 12 MPPA, as well as helping to prevent unauthorized parking and minimize drop-off. The need for and advantages brought by providing additional low-cost parking are strongly supportive of the strategy adopted by BAL. The monitor and manage approach will ensure that additional parking does not undermine public transport mode share targets and the objective of minimizing drop-off. And the point with drop-offs there is obviously drop-off and pick-up has twice the number of movements. So if I drive to the airport, park my car, and a week later I drive back, that's 2 movements. If someone drives me to the airport, drops me off and drives back, that's 2 movements. A week later, that's 2 more movements. So minimizing drop-off is important. BAL has already committed significant resources to delivering public transport benefits, and the proposed development will enhance these further, providing a comprehensive package of sustainable transport measures. Despite the design of the A38 improvements being agreed with officers and not featuring as a reason for refusal, Mr. Witchell has demonstrated that the technical concerns regarding deliverability are unfounded, and it would be nice if we could hope that all could be agreed. So Greenbelt, again, these will be much more familiar sort of topics, so to you and your colleagues, and therefore I can sort of probably pass over relatively quickly. Page 47 at the bottom, it is accepted that this is inappropriate development in the Greenbelt. Paragraph 302, we draw attention to Mr. Gertler recording his view on other aspects of the proposal. There does seem to us to be an inconsistency between him appearing as a witness to support reason for refusal and case and just being able to go off and do his own thing on this, but I say no more about that now, but we do regard that as unreasonable. We explain how Mr. Melling deals with these particular issues. Harm to the Greenbelt on page 76. There is an appendix to Mr. Melling's proof of evidence that contains an assessment of the land and its Greenbelt functions and harm to the Greenbelt. We commend that to you. And at 310, very special circumstances, and we identify 3 of them in paragraph 311 I'll just mention those. The first one is the need for additional car parking in the Greenbelt to facilitate the growth of passenger throughput. This is based on the robust assessment of parking demand contained in the PDS and the PDSU, which highlights a particular need for low-cost parking. And that's, so this distinction, as we see it, between the highway stuff, which can be in highways, and then the planning stuff, which is in planning, which is why this, in effect, says, look, need was dealt with as a parking matter. The additional demand cannot be accommodated within the Greenbelt inset, that's clearly a planning matter, in which an additional MSCP is already proposed. In order to make better use of development already within the Greenbelt, removal of the seasonal restriction on the Silver Zone car park allows for greater operational efficiency. Furthermore, the ongoing problem of unauthorized parking, which causes serious harm to the Greenbelt, as well as adverse impacts on amenity of local residents, will only be exacerbated so should insufficient car parking be provided at the airport. There are no other further suitable or available sites for car parking outside the Greenbelt, and the parking strategy on behalf of BAL assessed 25 off-site potential locations. None of the sites were suitable. And in the context of the Heathfield site, Sutherland's site, so unless planning permission is granted for that by the time you close this inquiry and come to a determination, that is just not an alternative. You couldn't, we would say properly, not grant planning permission for car parking at the airport in the hope that maybe something will turn up slightly Macabre-ish at another site, whether it be Heathfield or anything else. You have to face your determination, your decision at the time. And Heathfield just does not have planning permission at the moment. And thirdly, the need for and benefits of the growth of the airport, provision of additional parking is integral to the proposals to expand capacity. So we say there are very special circumstances, and we set out there the challenges, and on page 79 we summarize our case. Landscape, I'll deal with that again briefly on page 79. We have had now this evidence from Ms. Tudor, and we have paragraph 321 produce a rebuttal proof from Mr. Ferber, who responds specifically to her evidence. And then I come to planning policy and balance. So at the time of the determination of our application, NSC's officers were satisfied that the proposed development was in compliance with the development plan when considered as a whole, and the reasons for refusal subsequently identified 6 development plan policies that were said to be breached. Namely, and I list them, compliance with these policies is addressed in detail in the evidence of Mr. Melling. The acceptability of the proposed development with regard to adopted and emerging local and national policy was identified by the inspectors, you say, as issue A. So legal and policy framework, we draw attention there to section 38.6, obviously, and agreement on the relevant plans and policies. And then 326 is the balance. Mr. Melling's assessment of the planning balance is set out in section 8 of his proof of evidence. For the reasons explained in his evidence, the proposed development accords with the development plan. In particular, whilst other parties to the inquiry raise a multitude of points of dispute regarding the socioeconomic benefits of the proposed development, even on the most pessimistic of assumptions, the benefits are substantial. They generate 310 million gross value added, and the creation of 4,000 employment opportunities for local areas, including deprived communities. These are including the induced effects and so on. More broadly, the proposed development will deliver the benefits of increased connectivity, prosperity, and quality of life benefits. These are the very objectives of both government and NSC in seeking to level up regional economic growth, enhance international trade, following the UK's departure from the EU, and support economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. The proposed development will be accompanied by a significant package of initiatives to engage the local community and labour market, delivering employment opportunities and a means of improving skills. B, as with all airport expansion projects, the socio-economic benefits of the proposed development must be weighed against the environmental impacts. The airport's location in a rural area with low population density means that the environmental impacts associated with the proposed development are modest when set alongside a very significant package of mitigation measures. Policy requirements that environmental impacts are mitigated to an acceptable level. The detailed assessment in the ES and the ESA demonstrate that all environmental impacts have been minimized and, where necessary, mitigated appropriately. As such, the environmental effects of the proposed development have been satisfactorily addressed, a conclusion with which NSC's officers and their expert advisors had agreed. BAL's evidence has demonstrated that the environmental effects do not arise from the development are not significant, and in EIA terms. Indeed, certain receptors will experience a benefit in respect of noise levels experienced. NSC's position that the impacts on air quality and noise would cause significant adverse impacts is simply not supported by the detailed assessment carried out by BAL. Indeed, Mr. Piper's evidence, which draws on the analysis of the health impact assessment, indicates that the proposed development will actually result in beneficial impacts in terms of population health as a result of substantial socioeconomic benefits that it will provide. With regard to carbon emissions from the proposed development and the associated impact on the ability of the UK government to achieve its net zero target, BAL's evidence demonstrates that the concerns of NSC and other parties to the appeal are unfounded. Indeed, much of the evidence produced simply seeks to mount an attack on government policy or speculate as to what future government policy may be. Indeed, many of the points raised, in particular relating to MBU, have been shown to be groundless by the recent publication of the Jet Zero consultation, which is why NSC and others are so keen to understand and, I suspect, attack that. Government policy is clear. National policy provides, in principle, support for airports making best use of their existing infrastructure, subject to the balancing of environmental and economic impacts. The proposed development seeks to do just this. The means by which the government meets its legal obligations under the Act, the 2008 Act, are matters for government. The UK ETS, the setting of carbon budgets, and the participation in CORSIA provide such means. It is well established that the effectiveness or sufficiency of these measures are not matters for local development control decisions. Insofar as it is possible to do so, BAL is already implementing measures to minimize the carbon emissions from the airport, and this includes the objective of its carbon roadmap to be net zero. Through this approach, Bristol Airport has sought to be an exemplar airport for sustainable aviation growth across the country, and its draft CCCAP will formalize that commitment in a planning condition. The proposed expansion of surface-level car parking is integral to the delivery of growth at the airport, and the nature of the proposed development in the Greenbelt results in only limited harm to the Greenbelt, which is capable of being outweighed by the very special circumstances identified in the evidence of Mr. Melling. The Transport Assessment Addendum has demonstrated that even on a reasonable worst-case basis, the additional traffic generated for the proposed development will not prejudice highway safety, nor result in severe cumulative impacts on traffic congestion. On the contrary, the proposed A38 junction improvements will deliver significant capacity benefits, enhancing safety. The ambitious target of a 2.5% increase in public transport mode share will be supported by a comprehensive package of deliverable, sustainable transport measures. As explained by Mr. Melling, the proposed development is consistent with policies CS1, addressing climate change and carbon reduction, CS3, environmental impacts and flood risk management, CS10, transport and movement, CS11, parking, CS23, Bristol Airport, CS26, supporting healthy living and provision of healthcare facilities, DMP policy DM12, development within the Greenbelt, and DM50, Bristol Airport. As such, the proposal accords with the development plan considered as a whole. Indeed, this is what officers, who after all are the ones perhaps most familiar with the policies, concluded. There are no material considerations that indicated that the appeal should be determined otherwise in accordance with the development plan. The proposed development is consistent with national policy, including the MPPF, and the presumption in favour of sustainable development. The benefits of the proposed development will deliver, whilst ensuring that environmental impacts are satisfactorily addressed, is consistent with and supportive of national aviation policy contained in the APF and the MBU. National aviation policy is clear in its support for airports such as Bristol, making best use of their existing airport infrastructure, which the proposed development enables BAL to do. Growth in airport in capacity brought by the proposed development will deliver precisely the type of socioeconomic benefits for the surrounding areas and the southwest region that both NSC and government policy, economic policy, support the delivery of. The demand for growth at Bristol Airport exists despite the impact of the COVID-19 epidemic. The proposed development meets this demand, thereby retaining passengers and other associated benefits within the region. I then touch on conditions, which I don't need to mention, and then just a few words, just a couple of paragraphs on the CPO. As explained above, the highway improvements that form part of the proposed development require compulsory acquisition of 22 plots of land amounting to approximately 9,293 square meters for the construction and operation of the works. The CPO was made on the 15th of September 2020 pursuant to powers conferred by the Airports Act 1986. The inquiry into the CPO has opened today, and BAL's evidence for the planning inquiry is also therefore evidence in the CPO inquiry, although the specific CPO issues have been programmed towards the end of the inquiries. In addition, BAL has submitted additional evidence for the CPO inquiry specifically, being the written proofs of evidence of Mr. Witchell's and Mr. Church, and on individual CPOs. And I also draw attention to Mr. Melling's Appendix C, which looks at some of the specific planning issues relating to the CPO. So, conclusion. The evidence presented sets out BAL's case by reference to the issues identified by the inspectors at CMC1, the reasons for refusal, and other issues raised by parties to the appeal where appropriate. For the reasons summarized above and set out in detail in the written proofs of evidence, it will be BAL's case that the proposed development provides an opportunity to deliver increased connectivity, prosperity, and economic growth to North Somerset, the wider West of England sub-region, and the southwest. The proposed development is in accordance with the development plan taken as a whole, and there is no material considerations that indicate that planning permission should be refused. For these reasons, in due course, we will invite the inspectors to allow the appeal and grant planning permission. And so those are the end of our submissions, and I do appreciate I've overrun, and I'm grateful for your indulgence.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Humphreys, and Ms. Noble, if you're still with us. Oh yes, well, your icon is still with us, so thank you as well. Sorry, a debate of great importance as to whether we should adjourn now or continue. Let's continue, obviously, now with the opening submissions for the authority. Mr. Taylor, you estimated, I think, about an hour?
I think it's about that. It might overrun slightly beyond that, say an hour and 10, but...
principle has been set, so...
But, well, I'm slightly loath to follow that principle. I'll do my best to beat that.
I wonder if you could give us a break at about past or something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, have we got hard copy?
That's what I was just about to check, actually.
Sorry.
Mr. Henderson's going to sort that out. Thank you both.
Yeah.
So I begin with a short introduction that effectively summarises much of the case that the North Somerset Council intends to present. National aviation policy has recognised for years that technological improvement via the introduction of cleaner and quieter aircraft provides the scope for the environment within local communities around airports to improve. In that context, it only supports expansion plans which still ensure that those local communities share these benefits. The Council will contend that the proposed development does not achieve this objective. The Council will argue that Bristol Airport Limited has failed to recognise the requirement in national aviation policy to reduce the impacts upon and maximise the benefits for the local community affected by the airport's operations as an inherent part of the design process. In large part, the mitigation proposed to reduce impacts upon the local communities remains inchoate and of undefined effect, almost as if the mitigation has been brought forward as an afterthought. The result is a scheme which imposes a significant environmental cost, particularly in relation to noise disturbance at night, on a local community which then does not obtain any material benefit from the proposed growth. BAL's appraisal of the degree of environmental harm is understated, whilst its assessment of the benefits of expansion is overstated. The Council will contend that the development proposed in this appeal will give rise to adverse impacts and risk to health and quality of life to such an extent that it should be refused. The recognition that the world faces a climate emergency by the UK Parliament and the adoption of a net zero target by the UK government was a watershed moment. It means that we have to re-evaluate all aspects of our lives. It means that the basis on which we take decisions about infrastructure growth is altered forever. Whilst the government has identified that we must achieve a 78% cut in emissions for 2035 and net zero by 2050, it is yet to determine the extent of the carbon emission reductions that are necessary within the aviation sector. The Committee on Climate Change has explained that additional airport capacity can only come forward when it's established that the aviation sector is meeting its sectoral target to an extent that allows for additional growth. The absence of such a sectoral target means that this cannot be done. Thus, the Council will contend that it is simply too soon to allow the proposed development to proceed. BAL's claims of becoming a net zero airport are a smokescreen. They omit to include the far greater extent of emissions associated with aircraft and surface transportation. There is no clear evidence that the total carbon emissions associated with the airport will reach net zero at any particular point in the future. This appeal concerns, of course, the latest instalment in the incremental expansion of the airport. Bristol Airport, formerly Lulsgate Airport, opened in 1957 and has expanded in repeated increments since that date. In the 60s, the runway was extended and the former terminal building expanded. Further expansion to that terminal building and car parks occurred in the 80s. A new terminal building, the current one, was completed in 2000, and then the 2000s, or the noughties I think they're sometimes referred to, saw a litany of additional development, including a new control tower, and in 2010 planning permission was granted for a significant expansion, consisting principally of an increase in passenger throughput to 10 million passengers per annum, MPPA. That it was a near doubling of the floor space in the terminal building, a host of new aircraft stands and extensive car parking, both surface and multi-storey. Remarkably, the development permitted by the 2010 permission has not been completed over 10 years later, and the airport hasn't come close to serving 10 million passengers per annum. But this creeping form of development in a sensitive location and giving rise to a multitude of harmful effects is poor planning. This was recognised by the Council in the formulation of its core strategy, where it talked about additional development requiring consent beyond 2011 being expected to form the subject of an area action plan or some other development plan document, such as a subject-based plan for aviation, refining the detailed criteria appropriate at core strategy scale. It explained in the core strategy that that wasn't supported by Bristol Airport, but it remained the Council's preference because it would enable the community expectations to guide the planning process from an early stage, pending adoption of an AAP. BAL has simply ignored the Council's preference for an area action plan. It doesn't even have an up-to-date master plan. The last master plan was published in 2006, and consultation on an updated master plan petered out in 2018. This approach has resulted in a series of missed opportunities, in particular the opportunity to formulate a form of development which is guided by community expectations and which is consistent with the Council's planning for its area as expressed through the development plan. The first of these failings is made plain simply by looking around the room. The proposed development has failed to match the expectations of a range of different stakeholders, in particular the local community. The second of these failings is demonstrated through the Council's evidence. The proposed development is in conflict with a range of policies in the development plan, fails to accord with the development plan as a whole, and represents a form of development which is inimical to the vision for the Council's area that's enshrined in the development plan. Further, the proposed development must now be considered in a radically different world to that which has formerly prevailed. Never before has significant expansion at Bristol Airport been assessed against the MPPF, the current development plan, or in a legislative framework which mandates the achievement of net zero greenhouse gas emissions. These matters represent a watershed in the assessment of development at Bristol Airport. Indeed, they represent a watershed in the consideration of aviation development throughout England. The consistent thread through local and national policy, as well as the legislative framework, is one of responsible growth. Policy support for aviation development at any level can only be unlocked if the environmental effects of such development are resolved. The proposed development is not responsible growth. Rather, it gives rise to a range of harmful, unresolved environmental effects and provides modest countervailing benefits. It is a form of development stuck in the past and which fails to live up to the expectations of the modern world. Before outlining the Council's case on the main issues, we address key features of the policy framework, and we identify that it's characterised by two matters. First, the consistent theme of responsible growth at all levels of policy, and secondly, the dynamic nature of national policy relating to carbon emissions. The starting point, of course, is the development plan, which for the purposes of this appeal consists principally of the core strategy and the sites and policies plan, part 1 development management policies, which trips off the tongue nicely, doesn't it? We can shorten that to DMP. The development plan is entirely consistent with the MPPF and should be afforded full weight in the determination of this appeal. It's understood that BAL don't contend to the contrary. The core strategy in the DMP represents the spatial land use expression of the priorities in the North Somerset vision. That vision is summarised in the core strategy as sustainable, inclusive, safe, healthy, prosperous communities thriving in a quality environment. Underpinning the vision are 6 priorities: tackling disadvantage and promoting equality of opportunity, the development of strong inclusive communities, ensuring safer communities, improving health and well-being, developing a prosperous economy, an enterprising community, and living within environmental limits. The policies in the core strategy in the DMP provide the framework for the delivery of this vision and these priorities. The Council's evidence deals with the full suite of relevant policies, but we dwell here on policy CS23 of the core strategy, which concerns Bristol Airport specifically and provides that proposals for the development of Bristol Airport will be required to demonstrate the satisfactory resolution of environmental issues, including the impact of growth on surrounding communities and surface infrastructure. The Council is not blind to the potential growth at Bristol Airport to benefit its area. To the contrary, the third priority objective in the core strategy recognises the need to support and promote major employers in North Somerset, such as Bristol Airport. However, this priority is set in the context of the Council's vision, which we repeat: sustainable, inclusive, safe, healthy, prosperous communities thriving in a quality environment. Policy CS23 mediates the positive potential for growth at Bristol Airport in this context. In order to grow Bristol Airport, BAL is required to demonstrate the satisfactory resolution of environmental issues, including the impact of growth on surrounding communities and surface access infrastructure. There is no unqualified support for growth at Bristol Airport, quite the opposite. growth is only supported where the environmental issues and impact of growth are resolved. This is not an imposing hurdle for BAL, because the resolution of environmental issues is not, as BAL seeks to argue in this appeal, a mere simplistic question of balancing harm and benefit. Rather, it requires development which delivers growth without compromising the environment, both human and physical, in which it is situated. Moreover, this is a burden which rests on BAL. Development of the airport is led by its owners, whose responsibility it is to ensure that the environmental impacts of growth are addressed to the satisfaction of the Council or other relevant decision maker. The same approach is adopted in linked policy DM50 of the DMP. In this respect, policy CS23 draws together the other relevant policy imperatives in the core strategy, in particular the reduction of carbon emissions and tackling climate change in policy CS1, the prevention of unacceptable environmental pollution or harm to amenity and health in policy CS3, the achievement of sustainable transport which does not adversely affect the environment or undermine carbon reduction in policy CS10, and the achievement of healthy communities in policy CS26. Taken together, these policies, as applied to Bristol Airport by policy CS23, require that any growth at Bristol Airport is responsible growth. We return to specific aspects of these policies below. Turning then to national aviation policy, as with local policy, national aviation policy only supports aviation development where the environmental effects are resolved, and that can be traced through the full suite of policies, starting with the aviation policy framework, the APF. The government recognises that the aviation sector is a major contributor to the economy and supports its growth within a framework which maintains a balance between the benefits of aviation and its costs, particularly its contribution to climate change and noise. Accordingly, there is no unconditional support for aviation growth. Rather, the support of the APF for growth can only be obtained once it's established that the benefits of growth outweigh its costs, particularly in relation to climate change and noise. These environmental considerations are not simply matters to be taken into account, rather they shape the manner in which growth must be delivered. The absence of any unconditional support for growth is particularly apparent in the approach of the APF to growth outside of London, where it explains, we recognise that the development of airports can have negative as well as positive local impacts, including on noise levels. We therefore consider that proposals for expansion at these airports, that's those outside of London, should be judged on their individual merits, taking careful account of all relevant considerations, particularly economic and environmental impacts. The Council's decision in this case is an example of such local decision-making in action. As the Council will explain through its evidence, the claimed positive economic benefits of the proposed development are overstated and uncertain. At the same time, the environmental and health impacts are tangible and unresolved. At the heart of the APF is also the clearly identified need for aviation development to tackle its environmental impacts, and that's particularly the case in respect of carbon emissions, congestion, air quality and noise. And indeed, the APF mandates airports not to just avoid gross impacts on air quality, but to actually deliver improvements in air quality. We return to that further below. Turning to beyond the horizon, sometimes known as MBU, a consistent position is adopted to that set out in the APF. The MBU explains that the government wants to see the best use of existing airport capacity. We support the growth of airports in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales and airports outside the southeast of England. However, we recognise that the development of airports can have negative as well as positive local impacts, including on noise levels. We therefore consider that proposals for expansion at these airports should be judged on their individual merits, taking careful account of all relevant considerations, particularly economic and environmental impacts. Again, there is no unconditional support for growth here. To obtain the benefit of the support of MBU, it has to be established that the benefits of the proposed development outweigh the costs. Just as with the APF, the MBU does not provide any in-principle support per se for applications to increase the use of existing runways. MBU only provides weight in favour of a scheme once it is established that the benefits outweigh the costs. Indeed, MBU was promulgated at a time when it was anticipated that the environmental impacts of aviation upon those living in the vicinity of airports would reduce over time as expected technological change would deliver cleaner, quieter aircraft. The government was astute in determining that the headroom created by such change was not to be used by airports as a justification for further expansion, thereby eroding the environmental gains which would otherwise be made. As with APF, MBU expects that local communities are to obtain a share of the benefits of any airport expansion, both economic and environmental. It says the government recognises the impact on communities living near airports and understands their concerns over local environmental issues, particularly noise, air quality and surface access. As airports look to make best use of their existing runways, it is important that communities surrounding those airports share in the economic benefits of this, and that adverse impacts such as noise are mitigated where possible. As we explain below, one of the fundamental difficulties in the present case is the failure of the proposed development to recognise this imperative to share the benefits of expansion with local communities. The Council intends to explore the extent to which the case for the proposed development actually shares environmental benefits with the communities surrounding the airport. Finally, the Green Paper, Aviation 2050, that very clearly explains that the support for growth is conditional on the resolution of environmental impacts. It says the government supports airports throughout the UK making best use of their existing runways, subject to environmental issues being addressed. This is affirmed in the discussion of sustainable development. The government supports the growth and the benefits this would deliver, provided that growth takes place in a sustainable way with actions to mitigate the environmental impacts. Again, and consistently with the APF, Aviation 2050 goes beyond the mere avoidance of impacts to require reductions in carbon and congestion and improvements in air quality. Stepping back and looking at these documents in the round, there's a clear picture. The government does not support growth unconditionally. Rather, aviation development can only benefit from the support in national policy when it has resolved its environmental impacts and where expected environmental gains are shared with the community surrounding the relevant airport. This is entirely consistent with the expression of responsible growth in local policy. This approach emerges clearly on the face of these policies, but the reality of the situation today, as the Council's evidence will demonstrate, is that even these expressions of conditional support for growth are out of date. Changes in both legislation and policy concerning carbon emissions after the publication of current aviation policy means that the scope for aviation growth is now extremely limited and cannot be determined in an ad hoc fashion via isolated planning appeals such as the present. When extant aviation policy is understood in today's circumstances, it fails to provide a robust and up-to-date framework for the assessment of future aviation development. Turning then to the MPPF, there are many parts of the MPPF that are material to the assessment of the proposed development. It's not necessary to recite all of them here, but it's clear that the concept of sustainable development, as embodied in paragraph 11, is consistent with the theme of responsible growth in both the development plan and aviation policy. Sustainable development is, of course, development which achieves environmental, economic and social gains. The Council will contend that in circumstances where the scope for further airport expansion is limited, only the airport expansion schemes which are the most sustainable can be permitted to come forward. Any other approach would not be consistent with the objective of attaining sustainable airport growth nationally. I turn then to the outline of the case for the Council. The Council submits that the appeal should be dismissed because the proposed development fails to accord with the development plan, and other material considerations in this case do not indicate that planning permission should be granted contrary to the development plan. There are four fundamental deficiencies in Bowell's case. Firstly, Bowell fails to adequately address the uncertainty which pervades the assessment of the proposed development. Secondly, Bowell's not demonstrated, indeed it cannot be demonstrated, that the proposed development can be delivered on a basis which is consistent with the UK meeting either the 6th carbon budget target or net zero in 2050, BAL fails to grapple with the dynamic nature of policy on carbon emissions, providing no coherent explanation for how the proposed development is consistent with the attainment of these targets. Thirdly, BAL underestimates the adverse effects of the proposed development and fails to take the opportunity to deliver improvements and provide innovative solutions to these problems. Fourthly, BAL overestimates the benefits of the proposed development. We outline the nature of each of these factors in turn. Turning then to uncertainty, forecasting the growth in demand for air travel from a particular location is an inherently uncertain activity, and that applies across the sector. It's not specific to Bristol Airport. As Mr. Foley's evidence demonstrates, forecasts for Belfast, Birmingham, East Midlands and Stansted have ranged in accuracy from 51% above to 50% below the actual figure. The uncertainty in this appeal is even more significant given the unknown impact of Brexit and COVID. Indeed, the circumstances now are such that the uncertainty in forecasting airport growth has never been greater. BAL's evidence fails to grapple with this uncertainty or its consequences adequately. BAL has provided its forecast fleet mix and night movements for its core case alone, but no sensitivity test has been applied to these factors for slower or faster growth scenarios. In short, the implications for the full range of impacts and benefits associated with the uncertainty in the forecasts has not been assessed and is unknown. This failure by BAL is compounded by other areas of approach in its forecasting. In particular, it's utilised airline interviews to inform its forecast, but has only provided high-level anonymous responses from those interviews. Neither the Council nor this inquiry is able to interrogate this sterilised data, despite it forming an important part of the forecasting exercise. Similarly, BAL's not explained what values have been assigned to each market segment in its long-term forecasting. This too is an important matter which the inquiry is unable to interrogate. BAL's route development assumptions for forecasting in the shorter term don't provide sufficient evidence to either support the growth assumptions made with regard to business travel or to support the assumption that business travellers will make up the same proportion of passengers in 2030 as it did in 2019. BAL's bottom-up forecasts have failed to consider a reduction or levelling off of route frequency for the EU worker markets from, for example, Eastern Europe, and BAL's used historic elasticities from the Department for Transport's UK aviation forecasts, which are drawn from a world without COVID and before the implementation of Brexit. Of further significance is BAL's failure to properly take into account the arrival of Jet 2 to the airport. Jet 2 has historically bought second-hand and older generation aircraft, which it operates for a long period. This is in contrast to EasyJet and Ryanair, who tend to buy aircraft new and replace them at higher frequency. When Jet 2 is taken into account, it results in a number of stark differences, both in the number of annual movements and the aircraft undertaking those movements. Far from being sterile matters of forecasting, BAL's failure to account for this uncertainty and its failure to properly account for Jet 2 in its assessment of the effects of the proposed development cuts across a number of issues, in particular noise, air quality and carbon emissions. The effect of this is twofold. Firstly, BAL's evidence cannot be considered to be robust, and secondly, it's resulted in the underestimation of the adverse effects of the proposed development. Turning then to the failure to grapple with the dynamic nature of policy and legislation on carbon emissions, as explained in Mr. Hinnell's evidence, policy and legislation on carbon emissions is dynamic and fast-moving. Indeed, there have been changes in this area since both the decision of the Council to refuse permission and the exchange of evidence in this appeal. The clear thrust of the MPPF is to ensure that the planning system in both policy making and decision taking terms plays its part in securing the attainment of climate change targets and objectives. That can also be seen in the airport's NPS, which says that any increase in carbon emissions alone is not a reason to refuse development consent unless the increase in carbon emissions resulting from the project is so significant that it would have a material impact on the ability of government to meet its carbon reduction targets, including carbon budgets. Thus, it has to be demonstrated that if planning permission is to be granted, the UK will still be able to achieve the 6 carbon budget targets and net zero in 2050. If that cannot be demonstrated, then to grant planning permission would be inconsistent with the legal duty in Section 1 of the Climate Change Act 2008. In the absence of a government-adopted aviation sector target for the 6th carbon budget period and or in respect of net zero by 2050, the only means by which it can be established that the targets could be met would be to undertake a cumulative assessment of all UK emissions, including those anticipated from other airport expansions. BAL has not undertaken such an assessment, and indeed when asked to produce one by the PCAA, its response indicated that it was not in a position to undertake that exercise. Moreover, as MBU recognised, such an exercise is for government to undertake. The Council will contend that the Government has not presented any concluded exercise which establishes that existing carbon emissions targets will be attained with any degree of certainty if planning permission for the proposed development is granted. The result is that this inquiry does not have any assessment before it which demonstrates that if a proposed development is permitted, the UK will still meet the 6th carbon budget target and or the 2050 net zero target. This means it has not been established that the proposed development can come forward on a basis which is consistent with the 78% cut in emissions for 2035 or the net zero 2050 target which is required. But this is not a new position for inspectors to find themselves in. In the recent DCO examination for the A38 Derby Junctions DCO, the applicant sought to demonstrate that the scheme in that case would not affect the ability of the government to meet the net zero target. And the examining authority concluded, we are unable to make a recommendation on this as the relevant interim carbon budgets have not been published. The Secretary of State for Transport will need to satisfy themselves on that matter before making their decision. Further, in that case, the examining authority was not satisfied that the applicant for that DCO, namely Highways England, adequately considered cumulative climate change effects. They said this, in our view, a more suitable assessment would adopt a reasonably consistent geographical scale by, for example, considering the Road Investment Strategy 1 or the RIS2 programme, of which the proposed development is part, against the UK carbon budgets. The Secretary of State will need to satisfy themselves on that matter before making their decision. And the examining authority explained that the evidence that it was presented with was not sufficient for us to conclude whether or not the proposed development or RIS1 or RIS2 programmes of which it's a part would cause the UK to be in breach of its international obligations. The applicant suggested that evidence that there would not be a breach of the obligation would be available to the Secretary of State for Transport, and the Secretary of State for Transport will need to satisfy themselves on that matter before making their decision. Then the Secretary of State concluded, and I've set it out, he noted the position that the EXA had adopted and said that the Secretary of State is satisfied that appropriate consideration was taken of the carbon impacts of the RIS2 programmes during their development and that any impact is not incompatible with the national-wide carbon targets and commitments of government. The Secretary of State considers that the cumulative assessment of the RIS is matter for national consideration, as mentioned above, and is satisfied that appropriate consideration was given during the RIS's development. It went on to say that the Secretary of State was content with the assessment undertaken, that it accorded with 517 and 518 of the NPSNN. In other words, the Secretary of State concluded that he was satisfied that any increase in carbon emissions that would result from that development was not so significant that it would have a material impact on the ability of the government to meet its carbon reduction targets. Now that decision was challenged in the High Courts, and the Secretary of State for Transport has consented to do judgment on the basis of inadequate reasons. The Council will argue that you're in the same position as the examining authority in that case. The targets for the aviation sector have not been published. There has been no definitive appraisal of the cumulative effects of carbon emissions from airport expansion, from the airport expansion proposals presented to you, which enables you to conclude whether or not the proposed development will cause breach of the 6th carbon budget target or the net zero target for 2050. The Council will contend that since you are not in a position to undertake the assessment necessary, and neither is BAL, the proposed development cannot proceed unless the Secretary of State satisfies himself that climate change obligations can be met. But to do that, of course, an appraisal must be conducted and presented in detail to allow the parties to this inquiry to make appropriate representations and to address the relevant matters in their evidence. The government announced in April that alongside domestic aviation, international aviation is of course to be included in assessing the achievement of the 6th carbon budget target and in attaining net zero by 2050. Whilst aviation emissions may represent a small proportion of the total UK carbon emissions now, that will not be the case as other sectors respond to the need for significant carbon reductions. By 2050, the CCC expects the sector to be the second largest contributor to UK greenhouse gas emissions unless significant action is taken. And indeed, in the Decarbonising Transport plan published only last week, the government explains that decarbonising aviation is one of the biggest challenges across the global economy. The technological requirements to provide the power to propel aircraft the distances required far outstrip those for equivalent land-based transport. Further, the foreword of the Jet Zero consultation, also announced last week, describes aviation as one of the most challenging sectors to decarbonise. Indeed, it explains that the aviation sector will not achieve net zero itself. Aviation is expected to be one of the few residual emitting sectors in 2050. Many of the technologies we need are in their infancy and will take time to develop. Thus, the proposed development would simply add to the difficulty of attaining net zero in a sector where the attainment of the targets is one of the biggest challenges faced by the economy. In that context, the Council will argue that it cannot be established that the addition of the carbon emissions associated with the 2 MPPA increase in capacity at Bristol Airport would not have a material impact on the ability of the government to meet its carbon reductions. Indeed, the CCC, in its assessment of the difficulties that the aviation sector presents for the attainment of net zero, was very clear. In its 6th carbon budget report, the CCC's pathway to net zero only allowed for a 25% growth in the aviation sector in the entire period to 2050, and it recommended the introduction of demand management, explaining that for every 1 MPPA increase in capacity that was granted, 1 MPPA of capacity would have to be lost at another airport elsewhere. Even these assumptions resulted in the aviation sector producing significant amounts of carbon as at 2050 and not attaining net zero. It's clear that even on the basis of the level of growth examined by the CCC, for the aviation sector to attain the 6th carbon budget target and net zero at 2050, greenhouse gas removal measures will have to be relied upon. The CCC noted, however, that such measures are yet to be demonstrated to be available at the required scale in the UK for the aviation sector to achieve net zero. The CCC reiterated this advice as recently as the 24th of June, when in its update to Parliament, it explained that the UK already has more than enough capacity to accommodate the demand increases in our balanced net zero pathway. Our advice was therefore that there should be no net expansion of UK airport capacity unless the sector is on track to sufficiently outperform its net emissions trajectory and can accommodate additional demand. It goes on to say that that means making significant progress on nascent and untested technologies like hybrid electric planes and developing and scaling up markets for sustainable aviation fuels and greenhouse gas removals. It says this: it's not possible to have certainty today over the pace of development of these technologies in the future. It is therefore difficult at present to justify capacity expansion on the basis of outperforming the emissions trajectory, particularly given the uncertainty around the permanence of impacts on aviation demand from COVID-19. In essence, the CCC's position is that it's too soon to be able to allow any further net expansion of UK airport capacity. In other words, it's premature to grant planning permission for schemes such as the proposed development. The CCC's position is that further expansion can only be contemplated in the future if it is established that the aviation sector is outperforming the emissions trajectory required to meet the carbon emissions reduction targets. And we'll return to that theme of prematurity further below. So is that a convenient moment?
Yep, it is indeed. Okay, thank you very much. Let's take a short break till 3:45, please. Thank you. Right, it's 1:45. Let's resume. Couple of, well, sort of housekeeping matters. Firstly, on timing today. After we've finished hearing from Mr. Taylor for the Council, we've obviously got opening submissions from 5 other parties. Assuming everybody keeps to the time estimates, that's another 2 hours worth. And if Mr. Taylor keeps to his approximate time estimate, that takes us through to about 6:30, which in my view is too late. It's a hot day, it's the first day of the inquiry, and I know there are a number of people out there watching virtually, which is more tiring than being here in the flesh. So we were talking about this during the adjournment. What we would suggest, if this is agreeable, and this isn't a criticism, the longest of the openings, Mr. Henderson for PCAA, and I think tomorrow we're scheduled to hear from the PCAA. That's a good start, isn't it? I'm sorry. I know. Hello.
He was looking worried for a
Are you
moment.
changing sides, Mr. Henderson?
Not today, sir.
Yeah, if you do, probably let Mr. Taylor know. Right, I'll try that again. Sorry about that. Yeah, PCAA's opening is the longest, and you've then got some of your own witnesses to come. So what we're proposing, if this is okay with everybody, is that we will hear all the other openings this afternoon, and then tomorrow when we start, carry straight on to the PCAA opening. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you. I think I will probably be about 20 or 25 minutes rather than the full hour, but
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Oh. Pushing it. No, I think we'll do it that way. The other matter is that, Ms. Sutherland, I don't think has rejoined us. We understand there's been a domestic issue, so she may not be able to give her opening today. Her opening, I think, was only 10 minutes, so we might need to push that to tomorrow morning as well. But it may be that she'll rejoin us later on. So basically, this afternoon, we'll hear the remaining openings other than PCAA. Yeah, that was that one. The other thing I may as well mention now, we've been advised that today there's been a new version of National Planning Policy Framework published. We had no idea it was coming. We have no idea what's in it, but there it is. The note that we have had from the Inspectorate says that it is quite significant, but that's a general comment, obviously, across the whole range of planning matters. Doesn't necessarily mean it's significant to the matters we're dealing with here. What I suggest, obviously no one's had the chance to look at it, we certainly haven't. What I suggest is that we continue with the openings exactly as written, because we can't change horses midstream, and then when people have had the chance to consider what the National Planning Policy Framework revised says, we can see how we deal with it. It may be, I hope it won't be, that we have to have further submissions. It can probably be dealt with in examination and cross-examination of witnesses and in closing, but we've all got to see what that actually says. But I thought I'd throw that one in to the pond just to see what the ripples do. Okay, after that, back over to you, Mr. Taylor.
Sir, thank you. That's the second time I've been at an inquiry when the MPPF's been published without warning. Anyway, we'll read that later with interest. I was at paragraph 56, looking at the APF and MBU in respect of carbon emissions. The Council will contend that both the APF and MBU are out of date insofar as their policy approach is justified by reference to an appraisal of the implications of growth against a now out-of-date set of emissions reductions targets. The APF was published in March 2013, and as such it was formulated in the context of a statutory duty in the 2008 Act to cut emissions to 80% of 1990 levels by 2050, and further the APF adopted a policy approach within that context where international aviation was not to be included in the attainment of national targets. An 80% target, of course, would allow for offsetting from other sectors which achieved a greater than 80% reduction in carbon emissions. But that position has now been overtaken and it's no longer tenable. So the APF must be considered to be out of date. Today, the government has committed to including international aviation within carbon emissions reductions, to the CCC recommendation for the sixth carbon budget of a cut in carbon emissions to 78% of 1990 levels by 2035 and to achieve net zero by 2050. The approach set out in the APF is entirely at odds with those objectives, and its support for growth can only be seen to be support for growth on a basis which was not established to be consistent with the recently adopted targets. Further, the policy approach in MBU was founded on it being established that the small increase in capacity that it contemplated could come forward on a basis which would ensure that the then existing climate change target could still be met. Of course, those climate targets were not those which apply today. There was no commitment to net zero, and the policy was promulgated several years before the publication of the sixth carbon budget by the CCC and its acceptance by the government. MBU does not contain any assessment which demonstrates that the increase in capacity that it contemplates can come forward on a basis which will ensure that either the sixth carbon budget target or net zero in 2050 will be attained. The Jet Zero consultation paper published last week states, and this needs very careful wording, very careful reading in my submission, beyond the horizon, making best use of existing runways, and the airport's national policy statement and infrastructure, new runway capacity and infrastructure at airports in the southeast of England are the most up-to-date policy on planning for airport development. They continue to have full effect, for example, as a material consideration in decision-taking on applications for planning permission. The government is clear that expansion of any airport must meet its climate change obligations to be able to proceed. Whilst the Council recognises that the APF and MBU are the most recent policy statements made by government, that fact alone does not mean that the justification for the policy approach contained within those statements remains up to date. Rather, the Council will contend that insofar as support for additional airport expansion is provided in those documents, that support is founded upon an appraisal of compliance with carbon reduction targets, which is wholly out of date. Neither the APF nor MBU tested the ability for the UK to meet its current climate change obligations on the basis of the sixth carbon budget, net zero 2050, and including international aviation emissions. As such, to the extent that either of these policy documents can be construed as giving any in-principle support for airport expansion, that support must be out of date, since it was not provided on the basis of any assessment which establishes that airport expansion can be achieved on a basis consistent with the current climate change obligations. As a result, the Council will argue that to the extent that the APF and MBU support additional airport expansion, those expressions of support are to be given little weight, since it has not been established that such growth is deliverable on a basis which is consistent with existing carbon emission reductions targets. And I'd just depart from my text briefly just to say this. The statement in the Jet Zero consultation paper, and it is just that, a consultation paper, that MBU and the ANPS are the most up-to-date policy and continue to have full effect, does not mean that they are to have full weight. The weight to give to a policy statement is always a matter for the decision maker, and I'll refer to the Tesco decision in due course on that. And so as a matter of law, the weight that you give to MBU has to be considered and can, in my submission, and indeed that of Mr. Henderson, take into account questions of whether the policy is formulated on an up-to-date basis. Just as you can question a development plan that's recently been adopted, if there's a change of circumstances even immediately after adoption that undermines the basis of that plan, you can argue that that plan has little weight. We say it's the same principle here. Turning then to recent announcements, the Decarbonising Transport Plan. That was published last week, and that doesn't alter the position. It doesn't contain any assessment which is comparable to the exercise set out in NBU. Indeed, it doesn't identify the scale of growth for the aviation sector that the government contemplates in the period to 2050. The Jet Zero consultation will be a particular focus at the inquiry, and that document's notable because it brings into sharp focus that the government has set legally binding targets for the UK, but has not adopted policy which demonstrates how these will be attained by the aviation sector. It proposes to set a CO2 emissions reduction trajectory for aviation from 2025 to 2050, which would see in sector CO2 emissions of 39 million tonnes 2030, 31 in 2040, 21 in 2050, with any residual emissions in 2050 being offset by greenhouse gas removal methods, or alternatively, it proposes a trajectory based on net CO2 emissions, where offsetting and removals are considered as part of the target, which would require emissions of between 23 and 32 million tonnes in 2030, 12 to 19 in 2040, and 0 in 2050. These trajectories are more stringent than the planning assumption identified in MBU, against which the acceptability of the limited capacity expansion contemplated by that document was assessed. Indeed, the higher ambition trajectory, which is tougher than the CCC trajectory, still requires some 21 million tonnes of CO2 to be offset by greenhouse gas removal. The consultation states, this is from government, we currently believe the sector can achieve net zero without the government needing to intervene directly to limit aviation growth. The industry's need to rebuild from a lower base is likely to mean that plans for airport expansion will be slower to come forward. Our analysis shows there are scenarios that can achieve similar or greater CO2 reductions to those in the CCC's balanced pathway, which limits growth to 25% by 2050 compared to 2018 levels, compared to a baseline of 65% growth. By focusing on new fuels and technology and with the knock-on economic and social benefit rather than capping demand. We recognise that net zero 2050 must be achieved, and we must ensure that any growth in aviation is compatible with our emissions reduction commitments. So the basis for the belief that the government does not need to intervene directly to limit aviation growth appears to be founded in the 4 scenarios summarised in the accompanying evidence and analysis document. But these scenarios contain no appraisal of the degree of risk associated with the attainment of any of them. In other words, there's nothing which indicates the extent to which they can be relied upon. The supporting document, rather, that's to say the evidence analysis document, says in order to achieve the CCC's proposed demand limit of 25% increase on today's levels by 2050, our modelling suggests a carbon price substantially higher than £600 per tonne could be necessary. However, given the current evidence on the costs of SAF and hydrogen, we think before carbon prices reach this level, they would be sufficient to incentivise technologies to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This analysis suggests that capping demand may not be necessary to reduce emissions to levels which can be offset by GGRs to achieve net zero, such as the level suggested by the CCC's balanced net zero pathway of 23 million tonnes in 2050. There is much uncertainty, however, and clearly there could be many combinations of technology improvements, GGR costs, and demand growth which would achieve net zero. The challenge is to provide the right incentives and support to achieve this aim in the least restrictive and most cost-effective way possible. The statement that capping demand may not be necessary cannot be read as a conclusion that capping demand is not necessary. The evidence and analysis paper examines the 4 scenarios, looking at varying levels of growth between 58% and 60% increases in passengers, and it explains that the 4 scenarios we've modelled result in residual in-sector emissions of between 9 million and 36 million tonnes in 2050. The scenarios show that significant in-sector abatement could be possible if we make substantial progress with new technologies. However, making the required technological process will be very challenging, and there are many barriers that will need to be overcome, especially for the final 2 scenarios. Our trajectories also indicate that aviation net zero can be met by 2050 with future capacity assumptions consistent with making best use policy, with the making best use policy in the airport's national policy statement. The Council is intending to understand the basis of this last statement. It seems to suggest that some assumptions have been made regarding future aircraft growth which are not presented in the consultation documentation. There are concerns whether, as a result, sufficient information is provided to enable respondents to engage meaningfully with the appraisal which has been undertaken. The Council reserves its position to comment further in the light of any information that it may obtain in this regard. The Council will contend that the evidence supporting the Jet Zero consultation paper does not support a conclusion that airport expansion now will be consistent with the achievement of existing emissions reduction commitments. The evidence does not support the view that capping demand will not be necessary in order to achieve existing emission reduction commitments. And the evidence does not demonstrate that very challenging technological progress to deliver the trajectories modelled will be made, nor does it assess the consequences if it is not. In essence, what the evidence identifies is that it is too soon to conclude that capping airport growth is not necessary. The Council will argue that this material also points to a conclusion that there is no analysis which demonstrates that permitting the proposed development now can be done without there being any likely material impact on the government's ability to meet its climate change obligations. Turning then to the Stansted appeal decision, there will inevitably be some discussion of the implications of the Stansted Airport appeal decision letter recently. The Council will contend that the decision is flawed in numerous respects, not least its failure to consider the weight to be ascribed to MBU in the light of the factors set out above. It's notable indeed that the inspectors failed to consider whether the rationale for growth contained within MBU remains sound, notwithstanding the inclusion of international aviation within UK targets and the adoption of the 6th carbon budget and net zero targets. It's understood that the decision is now the subject of a High Court challenge, and indeed North Somerset Council has been identified as an interested party and is currently considering the extent to which it may wish to become involved in that litigation. Turning then to Bowell's evidence, it simply fails to grapple with any of the difficulties set out above. Indeed, Mr. Melling's evidence doesn't even contemplate that the matters as set out above could afford a basis for reducing the weight to be given to APF or MBU. The further difficulty with Bowell's case is that it fails to recognise the consequences of the current wave of airport expansion in the context of a policy framework which is out of date and wholly unable to guide aviation growth in a manner which is consistent with the attainment of net zero. Over time, aviation carbon emissions will become more and more significant. The extent to which growth can be allowed depends on the extent to which there is the ability to use greenhouse gas reduction measures during the 6th carbon budget period and as far as 2050. Asserting that the impact of a scheme is small does not establish that the additional emissions it will give rise to will be reduced or offset to a sufficient degree that the 6th carbon budget target can be met and that net zero 2050 will be attained. What is clear from Mr. Hinnell's proof is that not all airports will be able to expand, and that is because the expansion plans of all airports cumulatively go beyond what could have been permitted under previous climate change targets, and since the new targets are even more stringent and require greater carbon emission reductions, it follows that only some of the airport expansion plans can come forward between now and 2050, on a basis which ensures attainment of climate change obligations. Since there are more schemes than carbon headroom, there has to be a process of identifying which schemes should come forward and which should not. A comparative exercise needs to be undertaken by a national government to identify the schemes which achieve the sustainable growth objectives of Aviation 2050 and the MPPF. Only the schemes which rank highest in the attainment of these objectives, consistent with the amount of capacity for growth which is available to ensure attainment of climate change targets, could be permitted to come forward. Since such a concluded exercise has not been undertaken by government, BAL cannot demonstrate that its scheme would be selected ahead of other airport expansion schemes. It follows that to grant planning permission for the proposed development now would be premature. It would prejudge the outcome of that exercise. To grant permission for the proposed development would utilise capacity that might otherwise be assigned to a different airport to better attain sustainable development objectives. It is no answer to this difficulty to contend that airport expansion schemes should be permitted, since their use can subsequently be regulated by central government introducing controls to inhibit the use of any increase in capacity. Such an argument fails to recognise that planning decisions have to be taken on the basis of a balance of the impacts and benefits that will arise if planning permission is granted. If it is the case that once built, the use of a scheme would be inhibited in order to meet climate change targets, then the benefits of the scheme that were used to justify the grant of planning permission wouldn't be realised. If in reality a proportion of the benefits of the scheme will not be capable of realisation, or there is a substantial risk that it will not, then that proportion must not be taken into account by the planning decision maker, or at least it should be given limited, if any, weight. It follows that the extent to which government is likely to allow an airport to use any increase in capacity must be known prior to any decision maker granting planning permission, in order for that decision maker to weigh the degree of benefit that would actually be realised against the adverse impacts that would arise. BAL has chosen to present its case in the present appeal on the basis of an assessment of benefits and impacts that assumes the full growth of 2 MPPA. It's not demonstrated that government will or can allow this level of growth to occur consistent with the climate change obligations, and further, BAL has not demonstrated that its scheme is justified if only a lower level of growth, or indeed no growth, is permitted by government. There's been no appraisal which demonstrates that the benefits of a lower level of growth would outweigh the harm. In the light of the above, it's not been demonstrated that the proposed development will not have a material impact on the government's ability to meet its carbon reductions. The application is premature, and that's a concept, prematurity, that's well established in planning law, albeit usually in the context of the development plan process. The essence of a successful claim of prematurity is that the development proposed predetermines and preempts a decision which ought to be taken in the development plan process by reason of its scale, location and or nature, or that there's a real risk that it might do so. In the present case, the prematurity arises in the context of national policy. To grant planning permission for the proposed development predetermines and preempts a decision which ought to be taken in the context of a national evaluation of the constraints that exist as a result of adopted carbon emissions reduction targets, or that there's a real risk that it might do so. If the constraints are such that only some airport expansion schemes can be permitted, then the national evaluation must decide which schemes can come forward as best representing sustainable development. The capacity of GGR measures that will be available in the future is fraught with uncertainty, yet since the aviation sector will still be emitting carbon above the target levels in 2035 and 2050, the extent of growth within the aviation sector that can be accommodated depends in large part on the extent of the available GGR capacity as at 2035 and 2050. Given the scale of the uncertainties associated with the provision of GGR measures, BAL cannot demonstrate that granting consent for the proposed development will not be material to the government's ability to achieve climate change targets. In A Green Future, our 25-year plan to improve the environment, the government explained that the European Union Withdrawal Bill, now Act, will ensure that the body of existing EU law, including environmental law, continues to hold sway in the UK. Key underlying principles of existing policy, such as the polluter pays principle and the precautionary principle, are reflected in that legislation. And indeed, the environmental Environment Bill, currently at report stage prior to third reading in the House of Lords, requires a policymaker to have regard to, amongst other matters, the precautionary principle. The adoption of a jet zero policy is thus likely to be considered in the context of the application of that principle, which already forms a part of the government's approach to the environment. The precautionary principle states that where there are threats of serious or irreversible environmental damage, a lack of scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Thus, whilst there is significant uncertainty whether further airport expansion can be permitted on a basis which will be consistent with the attainment of carbon reduction targets, government will have to err on the side of caution by refusing to permit additional capacity until it has been established that allowing such development will be consistent with the attainment of such targets. The application of the precautionary principle leads to the adoption of the same approach identified as appropriate by the CCC and explained above, that there should be no net expansion of UK airport capacity until it's proven that the aviation sector is on track to sufficiently outperform its net emissions trajectory to provide the headroom for expansion. Even then, the expansion which is permitted to come forward should be that which best delivers the objectives of sustainable development. The Jet Zero consultation paper contains no discussion of the implications of the precautionary principle, and the Council intends to explore the implications of this at the inquiry. To conclude on carbon, the proposed development is premature. It would add to carbon emissions in a sector which will not attain net zero, even assuming substantial progress with new technologies, and where the delivery of these new technologies will be very challenging. On any view, in order to attain net zero, the aviation sector will be dependent upon greenhouse gas reduction measures to offset its residual emissions at 2035 and 2050 on a scale which is yet to be established as a deliverable on the necessary timescale. The Council will contend, as a result, it's not been established that the carbon emissions associated with the proposed development would not have a material impact on the ability of the government to meet its carbon reduction targets, and the Council will argue that granting planning permission has not been demonstrated to be consistent with the attainment of those targets. As such, it's contrary to the MPPF, Policy CS1 of the core strategy, and the duty in the Climate Change Act 2008 to ensure that the net UK carbon account for 2050 is at least 100% lower than the 1990 baseline. It will be said that this is a significant material factor weighing heavily against the grant of planning permission. Turning then to the underestimation of adverse effects, the common characteristic of Bell's evidence on the issue of noise, air quality, carbon emissions, Greenbelt and surface access is that it underestimates the adverse effects of the proposed development and fails to take the opportunity to provide innovative solutions to these problems. In terms of noise, there are two threads in local and national policy on noise. First, future aviation growth should ensure that the benefits of anticipated noise reductions are shared between the aviation industry and local communities, and that means that the aviation industry must continue to reduce and mitigate noise as airport capacity grows and as noise levels fall with technological improvements. Those benefits should be shared with local communities. Thus, local communities should be left with an improved noise climate over time, even where an airport expands. Secondly, the number of people significantly affected by aircraft noise is to be limited and, where possible, reduced. This means that significant adverse effects of noise should be avoided. Harm to amenity and health by noise must be limited to acceptable levels, and quality of life is to be protected against adverse noise effects, and health should be improved where possible. The proposed development fails to accord with either policy strand. In particular, contrary to the assessment in the environmental statement and the addendum thereto, the proposed development would increase the number of people experiencing significant adverse impacts on health and quality of life from air noise. The proposed development would not sufficiently mitigate and minimise adverse impacts on health and quality of life. For example, the proposed noise insulation scheme is insufficient in terms of spatial scope and only addresses internal noise impacts, not those in private and public outdoor amenity spaces. Further, the result of reliance on noise insulation and the noise insulation scheme is that in order to experience lower noise levels, residents must keep windows closed, something which gives rise to a further significant adverse impact on quality of life in locations which would otherwise be relatively quiet. As a result, the proposed development would contribute to a deterioration rather than improvement in the health and well-being of the local population, in particular those who are already affected by aircraft noise, by worsening the already significant adverse effects of noise associated with the operation of the airport. Further, there are a number of reasons why the conclusions in the ES and the addendum regarding the absence of significant adverse noise effects are likely to be unsafe. In particular, the LAQ metric is used as a standalone metric for the assessment of significance without consideration of supplementary metrics. LAQ does not capture all of the impacts upon individuals and their quality of life. The ES and the addendum fail to assess established direct effects of aviation noise on health, such as cardiac effects, stroke, hypertension. The air noise impact ratings used in the ES and the AS underestimate the degree of impact caused by the substantial increase in the number of air traffic movements. That's particularly the case in terms of impacts upon sleep disturbance at night within the local community. And the failure to take into account the decision by Jet2 to operate from the airport means that the future fleet mix is likely to be noisier than has been assessed. The Council will contend that the proposed development will give rise to a material increase in the number of households subjected to levels of noise above Seoul at night. These are impacts which national and local planning policy says should be avoided, which are not. As a result, the MPPF and the MPPG supports an approach that planning permission should be refused. In essence, the Council will contend that the noise impacts alone create a presumption in favour of refusal of the proposed development. In terms of air quality, at the international level, emissions of air pollutants should be avoided where possible, prevented if they cannot be avoided, and where they cannot be prevented, then they should be controlled to reduce emissions as far as possible. This is particularly important in terms of PM 2.5. Air quality standards and objectives are set nationally, but mere compliance with those standards or objectives is not enough to prevent impacts upon human health from arising. A complete assessment of the potential impacts of the proposed development must include consideration of the effects on health which occur even when levels of airborne pollutants comply with current national air quality standards or objectives. This is reflected in local policy, in particular policy CS26 of the core strategy. I'll contend via Mr Pearce that the core strategy does not require development to improve health and well-being of the local population. The Council contends the contrary. CS Policy 26 requires health impact assessments on all large-scale developments in the district that assess how the development will contribute to improving the health and well-being of the local population. The Council will argue that policy cannot be read as simply being process-driven. In other words, it's not simply about conducting an HIA where there's a large-scale development. Such a policy wouldn't have any land use consequence since it would achieve nothing other than the carrying out of an HIA. The Council will contend that Policy 26 was included in the plan to deliver a particular land use outcome. That outcome, explicitly stated in CS26, is to ensure that large-scale development contributes to the achievement of the objectives of the core strategy, which include an improvement in the health and well-being of the local population. Consistently with this, both national aviation policy and the MPPF require new development to positively demonstrate ongoing improvements in air quality by providing innovative solutions and incentives against ambitious targets and by identifying opportunities to improve air quality or to mitigate impacts. This requires a comparison of air quality without development with air quality with development, with the presumption that with the development in place, air quality will improve. BAL's assessment of the proposed development is flawed because it focuses on compliance with national air quality standards and omits consideration of how even compliance with those standards is insufficient to avoid harm to health to the local population living in the vicinity of the airport, particularly in a policy context which requires positive steps to be taken to improve the present situation. The Council contends that the proposed development omits to include the identification of any ambitious targets relating to the reduction of polluting emissions and doesn't include any deliverable, measurable, innovative solutions or incentives to achieve such targets. Despite having had years to develop a robust set of targets, solutions and incentives, BAL proposed to postpone the identification, evaluation and possible implementation of any such targets and measures to an action plan at some point in the future. This would not take place until Any leverage to require such measures to be taken in fulfilment of policy objectives is long gone. The extent to which the airport is actually committed to doing what can reasonably be done to reduce the impact of its polluting footprint is questioned. These omissions are all the more stark when BAO's assessment reveals a worsening of air quality due to increases in nitrogen dioxide and PM2.5 resulting from the appeal proposals. The Council will contend that the only reasonable conclusion is that development would result in an increase in risk to human health, thus failing to comply with the clear requirements of national and local policy. These impacts are matters that have to be weighed in the balance against the grant of planning permission. In terms of Greenbelt, there's no dispute between the parties that the extension of the Silver Zone car park and the lifting of seasonal restrictions within the Greenbelt is inappropriate development. However, BAO's assessment of the degree of harm arising to the Greenbelt is a woeful underestimate. The proposed development results in a permanent loss of openness to the Greenbelt in both spatial and visual terms. The current seasonal Silver Zone car park and the proposed extension to that cover 12.9 hectares. That area will be block parked with up to 6,350 cars, in addition to a range of parking paraphernalia. The harmful impact of such development has been repeatedly recognised by inspectors in enforcement appeals concerning off-airport car parking around the airport, none of which have involved development of a comparable size. They've all been smaller. Here, not only is there a loss of openness of the Greenbelt, but there is also a clear and tangible encroachment into the countryside, resulting in the loss of an important openness buffer around the airport, contrary to the purposes of including land in the Greenbelt. In order to obtain planning permission for the proposed development, BAO must establish that very special circumstances exist to justify the harm by reason of inappropriateness. Very special circumstances will not exist unless the harm to the Greenbelt by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm from the proposed development is clearly outweighed by other considerations. The Council will argue that it's not been established that any necessary additional parking provision could not be provided outside of the Greenbelt within the inset via a multi-storey provision. As we explained below, the Council contends the amount of parking identified by BAO represents significant over-provision. Further, public transport interchange is required as part of the sustainable transport proposals. At present, that can only be delivered by building out the previously granted permission that includes multi-storey car park 1. The provision of that additional parking reduces the need for additional parking in the Greenbelt. In the Langley Park School for Girls Governor's case, the court held that where there are no clear planning objections to a proposed development, alternative proposals, whether for an alternative site or a different siting within the same site, will normally be irrelevant. However, where there are clear planning objections to a proposed development, such as the provision of inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, the more likely it is that an alternative will be relevant and may in some cases be necessary to consider whether the objection could be overcome by that alternative. In the present case, the ability to provide further multi-storey car parking within the Greenbelt onset is clearly an alternative means of meeting such parking demand as may exist. Whilst BAO has a preference not to meet such while BAO has a preference not to provide additional multi-storey car parking within the inset, that preference is driven by its own commercial considerations rather than by any necessity. The extent to which it's been established that the provision of multi-storey car parking would make the entire development financially unviable and undeliverable will be explored. The Council will also contend that the provision of additional surface level parking in the Greenbelt will not resolve historic issues relating to off-airport car parking, since that form of parking will always undercut BAO's parking provision in order to sustain itself. Taken together, the Council will contend that BAO falls quite some way short of establishing that the harm to the Greenbelt by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm from the proposed development is clearly outweighed by other considerations. The Council will contend that very special circumstances do not exist and that there is a conflict with national and local planning policy in this regard, which is to be given significant weight. Turning to surface access, providing sustainable surface access to and from airports is an essential part of achieving sustainable growth in the aviation sector, especially because surface access is an important component in combating climate change and because the impacts of inadequate surface access are felt acutely by local communities. This is recognised throughout national and local policy. Within national aviation policy, 4 themes are readily apparent. Firstly, the important role of surface access provision in reducing emissions, in particular carbon emissions. Secondly, the need to reduce congestion related to airports. Thirdly, the need to increase the use of public transport to access airports. And fourthly, the importance of up-to-date surface access strategies, which underpins these other objectives. These themes are replicated in the MPPF and in the development plan. And indeed, policy CS23 makes specific reference to the need to resolve the adverse effects of expansion at Bristol Airport on surface access provision. In this context, the BAL's TA and addendum TA, as well as the various iterations of the parking demand study, fail to demonstrate compliance with these policy objectives in multiple respects. In particular, there are a number of deficiencies in the TA and TAA which results in an incomplete and inaccurate understanding of the effects of the proposed development, especially in relation to mitigation drawings, swept path analysis, road safety audits, walking, cycling and horse riding audits, and the junction modelling of the slower growth scenario. The consequence of this is that it's not been demonstrated that the impact of the proposed development on congestion and highway safety has been mitigated to an acceptable degree, and as such the only conclusion is that there is inadequate surface access infrastructure to accommodate the proposed development. There are a number of deficiencies in the parking demand studies, and the level of car parking proposed as part of the proposed development has not been justified. There is over-provision as a result of BAL's choice of operational utilisation percentage and demand to capacity ratio in the studies, as well as the growth in parking provision relative to passenger numbers and BAL's failure to assess the current sustainable mode share. Ultimately, these matters indicate that parking provision in the proposed development is over-provided to the extent that the Phase 2 silver extensions is not required. Similarly, there are a number of deficiencies in the assessment of public transport usage in the TA and TAA. It's clear that both national and local policy requires the sustainable mode share to be maximised, but there is no evidence in the TA of what the maximum is or that it will be achieved by the proposed development. Further, BAL's arguments concerning public transport are undermined by the lack of an up-to-date surface access strategy and passenger travel plan, as well as the absence of analysis to demonstrate geographically where the unmet public transport demand is situated, and the absence of any commitment or certainty that the required public transport interchange will be delivered. Ultimately, the level of public transport provision within the proposed development is inadequate, doesn't take account of all the opportunities to maximise sustainable transport solutions, fails to deliver a genuine choice of transport modes, and will not sufficiently reduce reliance on the car to access the airport. Back to carbon emissions briefly. The evidence on carbon emissions fails to recognise that there is an inconsistency between the emissions from the proposed development and the attainment of the emissions reductions envisaged in the 6th carbon budget and the CCA. The Council intends to explore the reality of BAL's claim that the airport will attain net zero. This will include the relative importance of carbon emissions related to the airport, as opposed to carbon emissions from all carbon emissions associated with the operation of the airport, in other words, including aviation. In addition, the Council will examine the extent to which BAL is committed to deliverable and measurable carbon reduction measures from all carbon emissions associated with the operation of the airport, if permission is granted for the proposed development, and indeed, if permission is refused. This includes seeking to understand the measures proposed to deliver sustainable aviation fuel at the airport and the timescale for this. In terms of overestimation of the benefits, the Council will contend that the constraints brought about by the UK's climate change obligation mean that there is only the ability to bring forward capacity to meet demand where this can be done on a basis which ensures that those obligations are met and where the benefits of expansion outweigh the costs. To elevate the benefits of meeting demand to a need is to fail to appreciate the nature of these constraints. The Council will contend that it should not be accepted that there is a need for the proposed development. Rather, the position is that meeting demand will bring some benefits, albeit not of the scale identified by BAL. BAL has overestimated the benefits of the proposed development across a number of areas and has failed to provide a comprehensive estimation of negative economic impacts, including environmental impact monetisation. Indeed, it is notable that the benefits claimed by BAL have declined. In its 2018 economic impact assessment, BAL claimed benefits amounting to 1,565 million, but this was slashed to 863 million in 2020. The deficiencies noted by Mr. Ciro's evidence can be summarised as possible. BAL has assumed that business passengers will make up the same proportion of total throughput as recorded in the 2019 CAA passenger survey. That approach fails to take account of the longer-term trend of lower business travel growth compared to leisure, and fails to recognise the effects of the coronavirus pandemic or the climate emergency on the attitude of business passengers. Any expansion at the Bristol Airport is likely to lead to displacement from other airports in the southwest of England and South Wales, all of which have spare capacity. When displacement is considered realistically, the result is a significant reduction in the jobs and GVA arising from the proposed development. Similarly, BAL's assessment of GVA per construction job is significantly higher than ONS data suggests and is not justified. And BAL fails to take into account the effects of Brexit, the negative factor of outbound expenditure, and a number of monetised environmental impacts such as noise and air quality. Indeed, even though carbon costs have been been monetised, BAL's calculation of these costs is opaque and cannot be fully interrogated. Another factor to which regard must be had is that the development will lead primarily to additional outbound tourism. Mr. Ciro has also identifies that most of the direct jobs provided by the expansion are likely to be low value and low skilled posts, and that may lead to adverse impacts locally in terms of an over tightening of the local labour market. BAL's claims of increased connectivity will be questioned. The Council accepts that whilst there may be some changes in connectivity, they are likely to be limited in terms of the factors which the APF considers to be important and thus of limited weight. BAL claims that the proposed development will result in the clawback of passengers who would otherwise make longer journeys to other airports to fly. The extent to which that is the case depends very much on the change to the services on offer at Bristol, which the proposed development will facilitate compared to the position if planning permission is refused. The Council will contend that those changes seem to be likely to be small. As a result, clawback is a matter to be given only limited weight. So to conclude, for these reasons it will be developed by the Council. The proposed development is contrary to the development plan and national planning policy. It doesn't represent sustainable development. Achieving sustainable development means that the planning system has three overarching objectives which are interdependent and need to be pursued in mutually supportive ways, so that opportunities can be taken to secure net gains across each of the different objectives. In terms of the economic objective, it's not been established that the proposed development can come forward at the present time consistently with the now adopted carbon emissions reduction targets. This is not a development that's needed now. It has not been established that this is development of the right type, in the right place, or at the right time. It's not been established that those in the local community who will be the subject of the adverse impacts of the development will obtain any economic benefit from it. They will not share in the benefits as national aviation policy requires. In terms of the social objective, it's not been established that the proposed development will support a strong, vibrant and healthy local community. Rather, the local community's health, social and cultural well-being will all be detrimentally affected. In terms of the environmental objective, the proposed development does not deliver any net environmental benefit. Rather, it will be argued that it will lead to greater carbon emissions and increased risk to the local community's health via increased air pollution and significant and substantial adverse impacts upon health and quality of life as a result of increased air noise, particularly at night. The Council will argue that whilst the proposed development would give rise to some benefits, these are not sufficient to outweigh the conflict with the development plan and national planning policy that the proposed development will give rise to. And so for the reasons I've set out, with the assistance of Mr. Henderson, as will be developed in the Council's evidence and submissions, the Council will submit that the appeal should be dismissed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor and Mr. Henderson. Now I've worked out which side you're on. Right, thank you very much for that. Unless anybody would like a comfort break, I'm proposing that we press on.
So if I can just give an indication of timing, I think it's me next in the list.
It is indeed.
While my opening in its current written form is around half an hour, I have a few points that I've picked up to make in response to the appellant, and one or two in support of the council. So I think we're looking at around 40 minutes.
With that, that's absolutely fine. With that information, anybody want a comfort break? No? Let's go straight on then, in that case. Thank you very much.
I'm very grateful, sir, and I think I distributed to the panel in the adjournment the written copy. Sir, it's well known and well understood, so much so that it has become something of a colloquialism, that our house is on fire. There is a climate emergency, recognised at local and national level in the United Kingdom, which prompted the adoption of the obligation to achieve net zero by 2050. But the oft-repeated mantra of the climate emergency can sometimes drain it of its force. That must be guarded against. Weston-super-Mare, where we sit right now, is predicted to be below the water level due to the climate emergency by 2050. Climate change could not be more locally and nationally relevant, and it is central to the determination of this appeal. We will in our lifetimes experience many severe impacts from the climate crisis, including increased risk from floods and more severe heat, resulting in higher heat-related morbidity and mortality, and increasing loss of biodiversity. We will also experience the economic and societal costs of the climate crisis, including the negative economic impacts of stranded assets. The most significant environmental and economic impacts will, however, inevitably fall on those who are now young and on future generations. The National Planning Policy Framework's focus on sustainable development obliges in paragraph 7, and thankfully still does in the updated version, that current need must be met in a way that does not compromise the ability of the young and of future generations to meet their needs. The proposed expansion of Bristol Airport would clearly contribute towards compromising that ability. Bristol Airport Action Network Coordinating Committee, or BAN's, case is that the proposal's very significant negative climate impacts, properly assessed, render it contrary to local and national policy when that policy is understood lawfully. The weight properly to be given to that lack of policy compliance is not outweighed by any other material considerations, meaning permission was properly refused by the Council and that the appeal should be dismissed. I pause here to say that I agree with and adopt the Council's submissions on the policy framework, the lack of cumulative impact assessment, the precautionary principle, the climate change impact of the proposed development, and on the planning balance. While BAN's case does not extend so far as the Council's in terms of prematurity, BAN can see the force in the Council's case, although it leaves that matter to the Council to progress. I set out in paragraph 4 a little bit about BAN. We campaign for the well-being of people and planet in opposing the application by Bristol Airport. And it is a group of campaigners primarily comprised of members from Extinction Rebellion and other environmental groups in the southwest region, as well as residents from local communities affected by the appellant's expansion. As the inquirer will be well aware, there is stark feeling against the proposal. There were 11,507 formal comments on the Council's planning website before the local planning committee. 84% of those who commented from North Somerset were opposed to the expansion plans. 85% of comments from respondents in Bristol were objections, and 99% from respondents in Bath. Most comments from local villagers within the neighbouring local authority of Bath and North East Somerset were also objections in high numbers, and these are places under or close to the flight path or impacted by airport car traffic. For the consultation period before this inquiry, 77% of the respondents were opposed to the airport's expansion plans. Turning then to focus on the climate impact of the proposal, one of the things that sets this proposal apart from other planning applications is that it is designed explicitly to increase a fossil fuel heavy activity, which is flying. No doubt the appellant will mention that flying, and has mentioned that flying only produces 2 to 3% of global CO2 emissions, but the percentage number is small simply because of the global scale. If aviation was a country, its 2 to 3% of global emissions means it would rank among the top 10 emitters, ahead of nations like Brazil and Mexico. And the percentage figure is higher in the United Kingdom, where per capita aviation emissions are far higher than the global average. In 2019, the UK's aviation emissions accounted for 8% of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions, up from 7% in 2018. Aviation produces a significant amount of CO2 emissions, which are projected to grow considerably, and which are exacerbated by an even greater global warming effect from aviation's non-CO2 emissions. The impact of increased flying is not small. The appellant did indeed, in its opening, emphasise that while the UK needs to decarbonise, that should not mean depriving hard-working families of their annual holiday abroad or preventing access to affordable flights to visit friends or travel for business. That too masks the reality. Firstly, the Climate Change Committee has emphasised that the growth in aviation, i.e. increased flights, is compatible with decarbonisation, and that can take place within current UK airport capacity. But second, and perhaps more importantly, the reality is that the very small number of people who fly regularly produce the vast majority of aviation emissions. It is worth quoting the recent House of Commons Library briefing. The majority of flights are taken by a small proportion of the population. In 2019, international and domestic flights made up around 12% of emissions from UK households, which includes energy usage in the home, other forms of transport, etc. But this is unevenly distributed across the population and is growing. A government survey of 1,000 UK adults found that in 2013, 70% of all flights were taken by only 15% of the population, and 52% of people hadn't flown at all over the past year. And you'll be aware that we update these figures in the proofs of evidence, and the updated figures are much the same. So in the United Kingdom, one of the world's wealthiest countries, 48% of people do not take a single flight abroad in any given year, while the top 10% of frequent flyers take over half of all the flights from UK airports. This socio-economic distribution of emissions is important, given that aviation is an energy and emissions-intensive activity which is utilised by a relatively small group of generally high-income individuals and organisations. It has an inequitable impact. A greater share of our ever-decreasing carbon budget going on more flights means less budget available for hospitals, schools, businesses, homes, and other forms of more accessible transport. And I divert here to say that this is relevant too to the appellant's wider public good versus local impact argument with which my learned friend for the appellant led in his opening. Also, the adverse impacts of climate change need to appear in the scales, and this is what the appellant repeatedly omits. Turning to planning and climate policy, BAN will rely on the expert evidence of Sam Hunter-Jones, a solicitor of the Senior Courts of England and Wales, practicing as a senior in-house lawyer at Client Earth. He sets out the way in which local and national policy address climate change, and in particular, the UK's obligations under the Climate Change Act and the current progress towards meeting those obligations. He sets out in detail the various reports from the Climate Change Committee, the independent statutory body established under the 2008 Act to monitor and advise on progress towards the 2050 climate target and the setting of carbon budgets. As well as being the leading specialist body in the United Kingdom on climate change, the importance of the CCC's advice in the context of planning is confirmed by National Planning Practice Guidance, which expressly refers practitioners to the CCC's advice. That's, for your note, CD 5.9, para 11. And I divert to say that in paragraph 215 of the appellant's opening, this was ignored when the appellant sought to minimize the Climate Change Committee's role. The Climate Change Committee is broadly akin to that of a statutory consultee on climate change, and its views need to be given due weight. All parties to the inquiry, I say at the end of my written paragraph 15, accept that the CCC's reports are obviously material planning considerations, and I'm sure I'll be told if the appellant disagrees with that. In December 2020, the CCC published its recommendations on the 6th UK carbon budget, which set out the balanced pathway to net zero. This allows for a 23 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year by 2050 for all aviation emissions, domestic, international, and military, and recommends explicit inclusion of international aviation in the 6th carbon budget. It clearly states that the steps needed to be taken to limit demand for flying to reduce emissions rather than the increased use of offsetting. The CCC's advice on airport expansion is very clear. It recommends no net expansion of UK airport capacity unless the sector is officially on track to outperform its net emissions trajectory, which it clearly is not, as the CCC says. The aviation sector-specific report released by the CCC explains that its approach allows for 25% passenger growth from 2018 levels by 2050, but this growth can be produced from within current UK airport capacity. Any airport expansion that does occur would require capacity restrictions elsewhere in the UK, i.e. effectively a reallocation of airport capacity. This is one of the reasons that a cumulative and in-combination impact assessment of the greenhouse gas impacts of the appeal proposal, along with current proposed regional airport expansion at London Stansted, Southampton Airport and Leeds Bradford Airport, amongst others, is required to make a properly informed decision, and the proposed expansion at Heathrow and Gatwick should also be considered. I divert here to say that this failure by the appellant allows my learned friend rather airily in his paragraph 238 to say that emissions of the proposal are well below those recently consented at Stansted, without recognising that this is in fact a point against him, because Bristol Airport's emissions must now be treated cumulatively with those from the permitted Stansted development and those in the pipeline. Paragraph 19, the documents publicised by the government or published by the government last week have not moved matters on particularly. The consultation document on Jet Zero proceeds on the basis that the government will not need to intervene directly to limit aviation growth. The underlying analysis document states that the government's modelling suggests that capping demand may not be necessary to reduce emissions to levels which can be offset by greenhouse gas removals to achieve net zero. It goes on to emphasise that there is much uncertainty, and the government explicitly does not take a demand management, including by direct intervention, off the table. Local decisions are the point at which the Secretary of State will consider developments since the last policy statements. Case law requires this approach, and the decision-maker must evaluate the up-to-date evidence, including any updated science, that postdates national policy and make decisions accordingly. The relevant national aviation policies allow for this, which the appellant fails properly to appreciate. First, the aviation policy framework provides policy support for airports outside the southeast of England to make best use of their existing capacity, but specifically provides that proposals for expansion at these airports should be judged on their individual merits, taking careful account of all relevant considerations, particularly economic and environmental impacts. Thus, the aviation policy framework recognises that making best use does not trump environmental impacts. Second is the government's June 2018 policy statement referred to in this inquiry as MBU. It is supportive of airports beyond Heathrow making best use of their existing runways. However, it explicitly recognises that the development airports can have is negative as well as positive local impacts, and therefore instructs that any proposals should be judged by the relevant planning authority, taking careful account of all relevant considerations, particularly economic and environmental impacts and proposed mitigations. The appellant takes a very specific approach in this inquiry based on MBU. The appellant's case is that the MBU effectively sidelines carbon emissions and removes them from the ambit of consideration of the inquiry. As they say, it makes clear that carbon emissions are to be considered at a national level and suggests that the MBU confirms the government's support of airports making best use of their existing runways is consistent with national carbon commitments. And see you also paragraph 251 of my learned friend's opening. It is incorrect as a matter of law to treat MBU as excluding any aspect of the climate change impact of the proposal from the inquiry's consideration, nor would it be correct to treat MBU as answering the proposal's impact on climate change. The MBU policy does not remove carbon emissions issues as part of local planning application processes. From the outset, MBU makes clear that, that proposals to make best use of an existing runway are subject to environmental issues being addressed. The express proviso, subject to environmental issues being addressed, is a clear statement that making best use of an existing runway does not of itself address environmental issues. Notably, MBU does not limit this to local environmental issues, and any residual doubt about this is removed by paragraph 1.29, which compels any proposal to be judged by the relevant planning authority, taking careful account of all relevant considerations, particularly economic and environmental impacts and proposed mitigations. Pointedly, the text does not limit this to local environmental impacts, so climate change issues, including the carbon and non-carbon impact of international aviation, must expressly be taken into account. I'll diverge to say that the appellant rests its assertion to the contrary on paragraph 1.11 of MBU without properly reading this paragraph in context or giving proper consideration to clear later paragraphs. The MBU policy expressly recognizes that there is uncertainty over future climate change policy and international arrangements to reduce CO2 and other greenhouse gases. The MBU is not conclusive of the approach to climate matters. In fact, its conclusions on climate are deliberately tentative. Nothing in the documents published by the government last week changes this. By requiring decision makers to take careful account of all relevant considerations, particularly economic and environmental impacts, the MBU requires important government and policy statements on cutting emissions to be taken into account, and also the Climate Change Committee's reports and the government's response to those reports. In this way, the CCC's advice, for example, in the balanced net zero pathway, is sewn into government policy on aviation, becoming part of the planning system. Finally, whilst MBU supports airports making best use of existing runways, this policy does not imply maximum use. Sam Hunter-Jones addresses the correct approach to MBU in his evidence and the ramifications of this for the recent Stansted decision. This decision is under appeal, as you've heard, to the High Court, partly on the basis of the approach taken on that occasion to the MBU and other policies, which I should also point out was not the same as the approach taken in the Marsden Airport decision. One small coda on this, and I diverge to say, MBU does not support a first-come, first-served approach, whereby Bristol Airport slips in its 10 to 12 million passengers per annum increase now. It does not step away from the proper approach, which is a cumulative approach, which is not the approach taken by the appellant. It is not right that the appellant can simply look to exploit any slack in the system. Moving on then to the extent and magnitude of the proposal's climate impact. The climate change impact of the appeal proposal is crucial to understanding whether it complies with local and national planning policy and with the statutory net zero obligation. BAN will rely on the evidence of Professor Kevin Anderson, an internationally respected climate scientist and one of the preeminent analysts of climate impact, to evidence the appeal proposal's serious negative climate impact. His evidence shows that the appellant's current assessment of the extent of greenhouse gas emissions is an underestimate, as it omits assessment of a number of impacts, and it also diminishes the magnitude and the seriousness of the greenhouse impact and relies on insecure and vague mitigations. Professor Anderson's evidence shows that even on the appellant's underestimate of emissions, the climate impact is seriously negative. The projected emissions in the appellant's with expansion case mean that the airport will increase its emissions substantially during the next 2 decades, exactly the time when the CCC's balanced net zero pathway requires a substantial reduction. The CCC's pathway requires reduction in emissions from the mid-2020s, but the airport's emissions in the with expansion case increase until well into the 2040s, with only a trivial 6% decrease below the 2017 baseline reached in 2050. In order to follow the balanced net zero pathway, Bristol Airport's aviation emissions would need to reduce by 38% by 2050, a cut of more than 180 kilotons of CO2 per year, whereas the with expansion forecast is for a reduction of only 6%. This expected 2050 emissions level at Bristol Airport is a 6-fold underachievement against the reductions required by the CCC's pathway for aviation. One of the key ways in which the appellant wrongly minimises the impact of the proposed expansion is to compare it to the whole of the UK's carbon budget. But the impact of any individual project appears small when compared with a much larger whole. The climate emergency is the result of steady inputs of CO2 into the atmosphere in individually small but cumulatively planet-altering quantities over decades and centuries. So Professor Anderson has undertaken the correct analysis and considered the impact of the proposed expansion in light of local carbon budgets for North Somerset. His evidence is damning. He shows that when Bristol Airport's aviation emissions are properly apportioned against North Somerset Council's carbon budget, they would consume its entire carbon budget in the 5 years from the start of 2028 to the end of 2032. By 2040, a single year of the Council's share of aviation emissions from the airport would use up the entire carbon budget intended for the 5 years, 2038 to 2042. The additional emissions make a bad situation even worse. The additional emissions from expansion from 10 to 12 mppa mean that by 2040, these extra emissions alone consume 82% of the 5-year budget. This is a far more appropriate comparison of the significance of aviation emissions than comparing with the national total, and shows just how significant the impact will be. Turning to the climate emergency and the proposal, this proposal comes forward in an area where all local and regional authorities have declared a climate emergency and have taken the position that the expansion of Bristol Airport is incompatible with the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions necessary to address the climate emergency. Bristol City Council was the first council to declare a climate emergency in November 2018, and on the 9th of December 2020, Bristol City Council voted in a full council meeting to oppose the expansion of the airport. And a majority of the councillors voted for the motion, which stated that Bristol City Council acknowledges that airport expansion is incompatible with Bristol, West of England, and the region's carbon reduction targets, and must therefore not go ahead. I set out a little bit more about Bristol Council's position, and then I move on in the next paragraph to Bath and North Sea Somerset's position, and I then move on to this council's position in relation to the serious global climate emergency, and then I move in the final paragraph to the West of England's combined authorities position. And I won't read those out, but I'll ask you to read those in your own time. The bottom line is that if we take the climate emergency seriously, then that has clear implications for this proposal. Moving then on to sustainable aviation, one of the ways in which the appellant attempts to address the climate impact of the proposal is to rely on various elements of sustainable aviation. And BAN will rely on the evidence of Finlay Asher, an aerospace engineer who from 2012 to 2020 was employed by Rolls-Royce designing aircraft engines. His evidence shows that very little to no weight can safely be put on the appellant's claims that various sustainable aviation initiatives will deliver emissions reductions, or that there are credible reasons why the climate change impact of expanding Bristol Airport will not be significant. He addresses proposed aircraft efficiency, electric flight, hydrogen flight, and alternative jet fuels such as biofuels and synfuels, and I set out in the rest of that paragraph a précis of what his evidence shows. Many of the difficulties and concerns that Mr. Asher's evidence raises concerning those matters chime with the difficulties and issues raised in the last week's Jet Zero consultation and the transport decarbonisation policy and the underlying documents published with it. The appellant has also relied extensively on carbon offsetting and pricing schemes such as the EU ETS and CORSIA. All of BAN's expert witnesses address these. The evidence shows that the UK ETS scheme is applicable only to domestic aviation emissions, which only contribute 4% of total UK aviation emissions, and that the CCC does not view the ETS and other market mechanisms as being sufficient on their own in achieving necessary emissions reductions for the sector and activities that they cover. Indeed, the CCC advises against placing sole reliance on carbon pricing, given the need to address barriers and overcome preferences driven by factors other than price, as well as to deal with myopia and price uncertainty. Turning to CORSIA, it is voluntary until 2027, from which point it is tabled to become mandatory for airlines operating in countries that adopt the scheme. There are widespread concerns about the ability of CORSIA to deliver actual emissions reductions through offsetting, given the lack of enforceable governance structures for offset credits and sustainable fuels, and the lack of verifiability of emissions reductions and removals. The CCC is explicit in its 6th carbon budget report that the CORSIA scheme is not currently compatible with the Paris Agreement or the UK's path under the current rules, and credits under CORSIA should not contribute to meeting the carbon budgets. I divert to say that the Jet Zero document consults on the position in relation to CORSIA and expresses hope that headway can be made at COP26. It has not rejected the CCC's advice in relation to CORSIA. And in relation to paragraph 229 of my learned friend's opening for the appellant, the criticism of CORSIA by BAN and other parties and by the CCC, on which BAN relies, is not criticism of current government policy or of CORSIA as a possible government lever. It is criticism of this planning appeal progressed by the appellant, relying on CORSIA now as a mechanism to address increased emissions, when it patently does not do so, and when the government is only hopeful it might do so in future. So to conclude, the proposed expansion is contrary to both local and national policy, focusing on the development plan, relevant policies, in particular the airport-specific policies CS23 and DM50, do not prioritize the growth of the airport at all costs. They do the opposite. Policy CS23 prioritizes the requirement that the Council be satisfied that the environmental impacts of airport growth are resolved. This fits with the spatial vision for North Somerset set out in the development plan in Vision 1 of the core strategy, which specifically states that when considering the future planning of the airport, there needs to be a balance between any advantages of economic growth and impacts on the region, and on the health and amenity of individuals, and on the natural environment. BAN's case is that the additional emissions which the appeal proposal will cause to be released into the atmosphere, both the additional carbon emissions and the non-carbon emissions, will contribute to hazardous climate change. There is simply nothing to which the appellant can point to address this. Allowing the proposal now will increase emissions because allowing increased flights now means allowing increased emissions now, at just the time when the CCC has emphasized that we need to be taking rapid steps to decrease emissions. The appellant's draft Carbon and Climate Change Action Plan certainly does not address this, and for the detailed reasons given in Ban's evidence, little weight can be placed on the draft plan. Any technological solutions which may in future help to minimize aviation emissions, one, are not available now, two, are a significant way off having any appreciable impact, particularly for the type of flights taken from Bristol Airport. Three, are speculative, and four, will not address the inevitable additional emissions which will result now from allowing increased flights. The additional carbon and non-carbon emissions will have an appreciable impact on the ability to comply with the net zero obligation, so the appeal proposal is incompatible with the CCC's net zero pathway and with the temperature and equity principles of the Paris Agreement. There is, as I've said, no sensible way to mitigate these increased emissions. Once the additional CO2 is released into the atmosphere, it will be there for over 100 years, and the non-CO2 emissions will, for a shorter period, intensify the resulting warming. That is the scientific inevitability of this proposal. There is also a high risk that the increased emissions will be subject to financial penalties in the near future, putting job creation at risk and contributing to the negative economic impacts which will be caused by the appeal proposal. The additional carbon and non-carbon emissions caused by the appeal proposal would have significant adverse impact, meaning the proposal fails to comply with policies CS1, CS23, and DM50 of the development plan, meaning that the statutory presumption against the grant of planning permission applies. There are no material considerations which justify granting planning permission despite the statutory presumption against. National policy in the form of the NPPF weighs against. The proposal is not sustainable development, particularly in light of the obligation to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, and the proposal is directly contrary to the requirement in paragraph 148, now paragraph 152 of the NPPF, to shape places in ways that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The MBU policy is a material consideration. That too weighs against. MBU does not support airport expansion where the negative environmental impacts of a proposal cannot be addressed, and those environmental impacts plainly include the climate impacts of increased flights. The Jet Zero consultation last week in the Jet Zero consultation last week, the government addressed MBU and made it clear that while MBU is a material consideration, expansion of any airport must meet its climate change obligations to be able to proceed. And I divert here to say that the limited reading that the appellant seeks to place on this, as set out in opening, reliant on the its of that quotation from Jet Zero, is not justified. The government was not in Jet Zero endorsing the appellant's approach of ignoring emissions. And to read the Jet Zero consultation in that way is an error. To use the Jet Zero consultation to interpret MBU in that way would amount to an error of law. The appeal proposal, to revert to the text, the appeal proposal will cause environmental harm, adversely affecting people and the planet. This is yet a further material consideration against the grant of planning permission, and significant weight should be given to that harm in the planning balance. The purported benefits of the proposal, which are even weaker in the post-pandemic world, are outweighed by the harm which the appeal proposal would cause. Addressing the climate crisis is the preeminent issue of our time. It is an issue of existential importance. And this appeal brings that issue into stark focus. The proposal's negative climate impacts, properly assessed, render it contrary to local and national policy when that is understood lawfully, and the weight properly to be given to the lack of policy compliance is not outweighed by any other material considerations. You will in due course, therefore, be invited to dismiss this appeal.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hon. I think we're now due to hear from Mr. Renshaw of Balpa. Have we got a written text?
I did send a written text to Joanna, but I'm not aware.
Ah, one was circulated apparently, but not up here, but not to us. Ah, right. But it's obviously gone to the programme officer.
It has, yes, it has, sir.
Okay, no problem with that at all. As we said before, we've got a technical problem up here, so we can't actually look at it, even if the programme officer has sent it to us. So, more than happy to hear your remarks. If you divert from your written text, if you could let us know, but otherwise we'll wait to see the text itself. Okay, over to you then.
Thank you. I am representing the British Airline Pilots Association, BALPA, which is the professional association and registered trade union established to represent the interests of all UK pilots. BALPA represents over 85% of all commercial pilots flying in the UK and represents pilots of all the airlines based at Bristol Airport. Now, staff working for airlines based at Bristol Airport account for over 30% of the total employees there. BALPA's case relates to a relatively narrow area of the appeal, reason for refusal 4, which concerns the proposed extension to the Silver Zone car park, which is situated within the Greenbelt. The decision notice states that there are no very special circumstances which outweigh the harm to the Greenbelt caused appropriateness. The appellant accepts the need to justify inappropriate development here. BALPA agrees with North Somerset Council that the appellant has not demonstrated that very special circumstances exist in this instance. BALPA's objection to the proposal relates to the parking strategy, and particularly the parking arrangements for staff. Its objections are twofold. Firstly, that the appellant has not considered the reasonable, and we say preferable, alternative to the proposed extension to the Silver Zone car park of relocating some or all of the staff parking closer to the terminal within the Greenbelt inset. Secondly, the proposal perpetuates a parking arrangement for staff, and specifically for aircrew, which is inadequate, gives rise to very real flight safety concerns, and generates massive, unnecessary additional vehicle mileage. BALPA's case starts with an examination of the changes that have been made to staff parking through the previous outline planning permission, changes that BALPA and other unions were not made aware of at the time. BALPA was not even identified in the list of stakeholders meriting direct consultation prior to the submission of the present appeal application. The changes proposed in the 2011 Outline Plan Permission removed staff car parking from the north side of the airport, near to the terminal outside of the Greenbelt, to the Silver Zone area within the Greenbelt and about a 7-minute bus ride away. And this was substantially enlarged as part of the Outline Planning Permission. It is clear that the implications of such a change were not fully appreciated by the planning authority. At the same time, Outline Planning Permission was also granted for 2 multi-storey car parks in the Greenbelt inset area to the north of the airport. After the staff car parking was moved to the Silver Zone to the south of the airport in 2018, displacing passenger parking, part of the relocated staff car park was then used to develop the replacement administration building under permitted development rights, though contrary to the development plan approved under the 2011 Outline Planning Permission. The consequence was a further loss of low-cost parking, as the car parking area had to be reconfigured further. Now, in relation to very special circumstances and reasonable alternatives, the appellant's parking demand study submitted with the appeal application points to a growing need for low-cost parking, the size of which is contested by North Somerset Council. The appellant wants additional space by way of an early extension to the Silver Zone car park into the Greenbelt for an additional 2,700 low-cost car parking spaces. It would appear that, at the same time, the appellant does not see the need for the early provision of the multi-storey car parking in the Greenbelt inset. BALPA will demonstrate the inefficiency of using former Silver Zone car parking for staff. It will show that if staff parked in the north side within the Greenbelt inset, either on surface parking or within a multi-storey car park, potentially 1,400 low-cost car park spaces could be made available in the Silver Zone immediately without the need to develop land. This could be achieved quickly. BALPA will demonstrate by way of empirical evidence that there is spare capacity for staff to park north side, even in the southern months, when the demand for airport car parking is greatest. I might add here that in the rebuttal, BAL say that the survey was undertaken at a time when the multi-storey car park lane just opened and they needed to get their pricing right. Well, that meant lowering the price quite considerably to generate the demand. And clearly, if staff was moved to the parking was moved to the north side, it might generate additional demand to enable the multi-storey car park to become viable a lot quicker. Going back to my text, in its evidence, John Hatton of BALPA also considers the cost implications of such an arrangement, in other words, moving to the north side. And on the evidence available, John Hatton demonstrates that this would appear to have a minimal financial impact on the airport. Furthermore, that assessment takes no account of the significant cost to the airport of the buses that it provides to ferry staff daily back and forth from the car park to their place of work north side. Therefore, BAL has failed to consider the relocation of some or all of the staff car parking as a reasonable alternative to the extent of development in the Greenbelt that they are seeking by way of the proposed Silver Zone extension. Indeed, not only would the relocation of staff car parking to the Greenbelt inset be a reasonable alternative to at least some of the proposed Silver Zone extension, but BALPA considers it would be the preferred solution. Principally, this is because it would overcome the flight safety concerns, which I will touch upon later. However, such an alternative would also give rise to sustainability benefits. In normal times, for most employees, the exceptions being air traffic control staff and the airport's own administrative department, there is a daily exodus of staff parked in the remote car park back to the airport, adding unnecessary traffic on the A38 and generating massive, unnecessary bus mileage, which is not sustainable. The airport is rightly looking to ensure that sustainable travel by passengers and staff is maximised. The parking strategy for staff parking is simply that the airport won't be providing any more car parking, so employees will just have to change their mode of travel. However, BALPA will highlight the discrepancy between the comments in the draft workplace travel plan, which notes the difficulties that 60% of staff working variable shifts, such as aircrew, have in travelling by means other than the car early morning and late at night, and the target for sustainable travel by staff. It follows that the failure by the appellant to consider the reasonable alternative to the Silver Zone extension of relocating some or all of the staff car parking to the Greenbelt inset nearer to the terminal undermines BAL's very special circumstances case. Turning to the adequacy of parking and flight safety, BALPA will argue that the parking strategy for staff is contrary to core strategy policy CS11, which states that adequate parking must be provided and managed to meet the needs of anticipated users. In particular, Simon Williams of BALPA will illustrate that there are significant flight safety implications arising from the separation of the staff car park from the north side of the airport, where the aircrew report. BALPA's evidence has set out the legal requirement on aircrew to ensure sufficient rest between duties. The location of the staff parking threatens the achievement of sufficient rest for certain crew who have a longer commute, as a result of the additional time required to get to the airport from the car parking due to the extra journey time allowance caused by the need to transfer to the staff bus. It also adds additional and unnecessary uncertainty caused to the length of the commute. As will be explained, these are legitimate and real concerns that have been shared by pilots with BALPA's representative. Indeed, BALPA will show that the airport has previously recognised that the sensible and appropriate location for most staff car parking is close to the terminal. BALPA understands that the inspectors have preliminary concerns in respect of the appropriateness of considering the merits of the location of the staff car parking and its impacts on flight safety, because its relocation was undertaken following an earlier planning permission and would have been considered by the Council at that time. BALPA considers it is reasonable and appropriate to address this matter as part of the appeal for the following reasons. First, the application proposes the retention of staff car parking in its current location as part of the parking strategy. Moreover, the staff car park falls within the red line boundary on the proposed site plans. The retention, therefore, forms part of the proposal under consideration at this appeal. I should also add, not in the text, that in the airport's parking strategy document, the relocation of staff car parking is given as a reason for a 1,000 space loss of passenger parking in 2018. Secondly, it is clear, it is clear that the location of staff car parking was not considered in any depth by the Council as part of the 2011 outline planning submission, but only as part of the overall justification for expanding the Silver Zone car park into the Greenbelt. As noted earlier, BALPA considers that its location raises significant issues regarding flight safety. Third, the inadequacies of the current and proposed arrangements are such that the proposed relocation to within the Greenbelt inset, in BALPA's view, is an obvious, reasonable alternative to extension of part or all of the Silver Zone. There was a meeting last week with the airport management regarding the location of staff parking, but I understand the airport did not consider that any change was necessary in its location. Accordingly, BALPA considers that the location of staff car parking is a material consideration for the determination of the appeal. It contends that it would be reasonable and proportionate to hear its evidence in relation to the location of the staff car parking and in particular flight safety issues, which would not be of significant length in the context of this appeal. However, BALPA would only wish to give evidence on these matters and take up what it recognises is valuable inquiry time if the inspectors consider it to be capable of being material to their determination, including material to the imposition of conditions. If, having heard this opening, the inspectors remain of the view that such matters are immaterial to their determination, BALPA will not call evidence on this matter and will restrict itself to the very special circumstances case, albeit inevitably there is a degree of overlap. BALPA would request further guidance from the inspectors on this matter. To conclude, BALPA will demonstrate that the car parking strategy has failed to justify why there are very special circumstances to permit the scale of expansion of car parking into the Greenbelt. And subject to the clarification of the inspector's position, will also wish to present evidence that the location of staff car parking has potential flight safety implications. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Renshaw. Just on that matter, you're obviously seeking some seeking some guidance from us. We will give that guidance, but I think what we need to do is resolve our technical problems so we can reread that part of your opening submission, and I think hopefully give that guidance first thing tomorrow morning. But obviously subject to our getting hold of the text. But yeah, your request is certainly noted, and we'll act on it.
Thank you, sir.
I don't believe that Ms. Sutherland has rejoined us. So on that basis, the only remaining opening submission is from XR Elders. Ms. Beth, are you with us?
I am.
Right.
Just.
Welcome. Have you got a text that you're going to be reading from?
I have, and I've submitted it to Joanna.
Okay.
I'm virtual, so I'm afraid I can't hand you a paper copy.
It would be a good trick if you could. Okay, no, that's absolutely fine. And if, as with Mr. Renshaw, if you could just indicate to us where you're going to divert from that text, it would be very useful. Oh, I gather that one of my more technologically adept colleagues has got it. I haven't, but there we are. Okay, over to you then, Ms. Beth.
Thank you. I don't intend to divert, and it's quite a short statement. So, XR Elders is an affinity group of older people within Extinction Rebellion, an organisation dedicated to persuading governments to act with proper urgency on the climate and ecological crisis. And just to say, we appear at this inquiry in good faith, respecting its remit and rules. There are many sound planning reasons for refusing this application, and we deal with some of them in our proofs of evidence. We support the evidence of other Rule 6 parties on climate change and carbon emissions and on the unacceptable impact on local communities, but we do not duplicate it. Our evidence suggests that the pandemic will have a longer term impact than Bristol Airport has admitted. Forecasts of business as usual after a short-term reversal cannot be assumed. As the consequences of climate change become ever more apparent, there is increasing awareness of the need for personal action on reducing carbon emissions. We present evidence that social attitudes to flying are changing because of its carbon burden, and that this will tend to reduce future demand for air travel. In this changing world, forecasts of likely dates by which the airport may have expanded are very uncertain. The original pre-pandemic forecasts from Bristol Airport were too optimistic, as assessed by the local planning authority and their consultants. More recent forecast revisions are still not credible, as we have shown in our evidence. They have not properly taken into account a range of important factors that would tend to increase ticket price and slow future growth compared with past trends. The acknowledged delay to an increase in passenger numbers at Bristol Airport moves the context of any future expansion into a different planning and policy environment. By 2030, the requirements of achieving zero carbon by 2050 are likely to result in further restrictions on the carbon emissions of flying, thereby increasing costs. Previous rates of increase in air travel, stimulated by cheaper flights, will not be repeated. We argue that in the future, the relative cost of air travel is likely to increase, resulting in falling demand, particularly in leisure travel. Potential socio-economic benefits from airport expansion have therefore become much less certain. Meanwhile, the disbenefits, including immediate expansion of parking on the Greenbelt and impact on the AONB, remain just as important. We argue here that a proposal that was not acceptable in the first place has become even less acceptable. And that's our case in outline.
Thank you very much indeed. We're just checking to see if Ms. Sutherland has returned. I think probably not. Okay. No. That then concludes our business for the day. We'll resume at 9:30 tomorrow morning, when hopefully we'll hear from Ms. Sutherland with her opening submission, and then turn to PCAA, Mr. Morehouse. Got your name right this time. Anything else we need to pick up on? No. Okay, thank you all very much indeed. We'll be back at 9:30 tomorrow morning.